Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. It happened last summer, and I still can't wrap my head around it. I'm not someone who believes in the paranormal or cryptids or whatever, but what happened that night at Davis Lake has me questioning everything. My buddies and I go camping every summer near Davis Lake, northwest of Kettle Falls in Washington. It's become our tradition, just a few days away from our wives and kids, to fish, drink beer, and bullshit around a campfire. Nothing fancy, but it's our thing. Last year there were 4 of us, me, 38, Jake, 41, Ronnie, 36, and his brother Mike, 34. The spot we go to is pretty remote. I mean, you can't just drive up to it. You have to park at this small clearing and hike in about a half mile. The forest there is incredibly dense, old growth stuff with massive trees and undergrowth so thick that we actually walk on fallen logs in some places to avoid having to machete our way through. It's like walking on nature's boardwalks. We've been going to the same spot for 5 years, and we've never seen another soul out there. That night started like any other. We'd had a good day fishing, caught enough trout for dinner, and were sitting around the fire drinking and telling the same old stories we always tell. The stars were incredible. One of those clear summer nights where the Milky Way looks like someone spilled paint across the sky. Around 1 a.m., I needed to use the outhouse. We call it an outhouse, but it's really just a pit toilet the Forest Service maintains. It's about 70 yards from our campsite, down this narrow trail. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. I'd had a few beers, but I wasn't drunk. Just that nice, relaxed feeling, you know. The outhouse itself is this small wooden structure with a metal roof. It's got those typical half-moon cutouts on the door and smells exactly how you'd expect. Nothing special about it. I went in, did my business, and was just about to head back when I heard it. At first it was just rustling, like something moving through the bushes, but not in that way deer or smaller animals move. This was deliberate, slower, heavier. I froze with my hand on the door. The sound was coming from maybe 100 yards away, deeper in the forest, away from our camp. Then came the thumps, 3 distinct, deep thumps. Not like footsteps exactly, but almost like someone dropping something heavy onto the ground. Thump, thump, thump. I still remember exactly how it sounded. Deep, reverberating, like you could feel it in your chest even though it wasn't that loud. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. Out in the middle of nowhere, in the pitch black except for my little flashlight. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then I heard more rustling, and the thumps again. Only this time, they were closer. Maybe 50 yards away. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I flicked my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam only reached about 30 feet before disappearing into the darkness. Nothing but trees and undergrowth. Then the rustling stopped. Complete silence. The kind of silence that feels like pressure on your eardrums. I thought maybe whatever it was had moved on, but then the thumps came again. Thump. 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 Even closer now, like 25-30 yards away, and between each thump I could hear something large moving through the underbrush. At that point, I didn't care if it was a bear, a mountain lion, or a damn serial killer. I got the hell out of there. I took off running down the trail back to camp, my flashlight bouncing wildly, barely lighting my way. I nearly tripped twice on tree roots, but adrenaline kept me upright. When I burst into camp, my friends immediately knew something was wrong. I was out of breath, sweating despite the cool night air, and probably white as a sheet. "What the hell, man? You look like you've seen a ghost," Jake said. Between breaths, I managed to tell them what I'd heard. To my surprise, they didn't laugh or give me shit. "We heard it too," Ronnie said quietly. What? I couldn't believe it. Mike nodded. Yeah, about 5 minutes ago. We thought it was you messing around at first. Jake threw another log on the fire, making it flare up. It didn't sound like any animal I know, he said. Jake's been hunting these woods since he was a kid, so that statement hit me hard. We sat there in silence for a minute, all of us straining to hear. The normal forest sounds had returned. Crickets, the occasional rustle of small nocturnal animals, the soft whoosh of wind through the treetops. But no thumps. Should we check it out? Mike suggested half-heartedly, but none of us moved. The idea of venturing into that dense forest with just our flashlights seemed insane. Let's wait until morning, Jake said finally. None of us argued. We stayed up for hours after that, keeping the fire blazing much higher than we normally would. We talked in low voices, each of us suggesting what it could have been. A bear standing on its hind legs and dropping back down, some kind of territorial display. Maybe someone else camping nearby, playing a prank. But none of the explanations felt right. The forest around Davis Lake is far too dense for anyone to navigate at night without serious lighting. And the sounds were too regular, too deliberate for a random animal. The thumps didn't return that night. But none of us slept well. At first light, we cautiously explored the area around the outhouse. The ground was soft from a light rain the previous day, but we couldn't find any distinct tracks or signs of what made the noise. Just some broken branches and disturbed undergrowth that could have been caused by anything. We cut our trip short that day. None of us admitted it was because of what happened, but we packed up by noon and hiked out. The whole way back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching us from between the trees. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds. I went into my garage and started experimenting, trying to recreate the thumps. I tried dropping different things on the ground, logs, rocks, tools. Nothing matched. Then I remembered this 30-pound cement fence pole footer I had left over from a project. I took it to my backyard, where the ground was still damp from watering the lawn, and dropped it from about 3 feet up. The sound it made was almost exactly what I'd heard that night. That deep, resonant thump that you feel as much as hear. I did it 3 times in a row, and the hair on my arms stood up. It was the same sound, no question. A week later, at a family barbecue, I finally worked up the courage to mention what had happened to my sister-in-law, Kim. She grew up near Kettle Falls and has camped all over that area. When I described the location and the sounds, she got this strange look on her face. About 5 years ago, she said, lowering her voice, my friends Tracy and Dan were camping in that exact same area. They have one of those pickup truck campers, you know? In the middle of the night, they woke up because the camper was rocking. Not violently, but definitely moving. I felt a chill run down my spine as she continued. Dan thought it might be a bear, so he carefully looked out the window. He said he was eye level with the face of this creature. Tall, covered in dark hair, with a face that was somehow both ape-like and human. And about 50 feet behind it was a smaller one, like a juvenile. Dan said they just stared at each other for what felt like forever, and then the creatures calmly turned and walked into the forest. I didn't know what to say. Tracy and Dan aren't the type to make up stories or exaggerate. They're practical people, both avid outdoors enthusiasts. Did they ever go back? I asked. Kim shook her head. Never. They sold the camper a month later. I haven't been back to Davis Lake either. My friends and I chose a different spot this summer, closer to civilization. We never really talked about why we changed locations. We didn't need to. I still don't know what was in those woods that night. Logic tells me it was probably a bear or some other animal, but then I think about those deliberate thumps. The way whatever it was seemed to be approaching the outhouse methodically, and how the sound matched exactly with a heavy object being dropped on the ground. I think about what my sister-in-law told me, and I wonder. Whatever it was intelligent enough to communicate or warn with those thumps. It was large enough to move through incredibly dense forest with ease, and it was confident enough to approach 4 grown men at their campsite in the middle of the night. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear those thumps again. Thump, thump, thump. And I lie there in the dark, wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed in that outhouse just a little longer, or if I'd pointed my flashlight in exactly the right spot between the trees. I don't want to know the answer. Some things are better left in the darkness of those woods. Story 2. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night back in 2009. It's been over a decade, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. Some memories just burn themselves into your brain. You know, this is one of those. I grew up in this tiny town near the Canadian border in Washington. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is when someone gets a new truck. Me and my 2 best friends, Jake and Trevor, were just typical small-town kids looking for ways to kill time. We were all 17 that summer, with nothing but our driver's licenses and Jake's beat-up Ford Explorer to our names. That night started like any other Friday. We'd been hanging out at Jake's place, playing video games and bullshitting about girls from school. His parents were out of town visiting his aunt in Spokane, so we had the house to ourselves. Around 11 p.m. we got hungry and decided to make a run to the 24-hour gas station about 20 minutes away for snacks. It was mid-August, and even though it was late, it was still warm enough that we had the windows down. The radio was playing some crappy country song that Trevor kept singing along to just to annoy me. We were taking the back road that runs along the Kettle River, a shortcut we'd driven 100 times before. The road was dead empty. No surprise there. Hardly anyone uses it that late. It's pretty remote, with dense forest on both sides, and barely any houses for miles. The headlights cut through the darkness, and occasionally we'd see the reflection of some animal's eyes on the side of the road, usually deer or sometimes a fox. Jake was driving. I was riding shotgun, and Trevor was in the back. We were about halfway to the gas station when it happened. Jake suddenly slammed on the brakes so hard that I jerked forward, almost hitting my head on the dashboard. "What the fuck, man?" I yelled, but Jake didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. About 40 yards ahead of us, illuminated in the headlights, was what I initially thought was a grizzly bear. My heart practically stopped. We'd had bear warnings that summer, and I'd heard stories about them attacking cars. But within seconds, I realized this wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright like that. This thing was walking on 2 legs, moving diagonally across the road from right to left. "Holy shit," Trevor whispered from the back seat. "Is that a person in a costume?" It wasn't. No costume could move that naturally. This thing was tall, I'd guess around 7 feet. It was covered in dark brown fur that looked matted in places, and the way it moved, it was fluid, but somehow wrong, like a human movement, but exaggerated. We sat there frozen as it reached the middle of the road. Then it stopped and turned and looked directly at us. That moment will haunt me until the day I die. Its face was, I don't even know how to describe it. Not human, but not fully animal either. Kind of ape-like, with a pronounced brow. But the eyes were aware, intelligent. It was looking at us with what I can only describe as curiosity mixed with caution. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other, 3 terrified teenagers in a car and this impossible creature in the middle of a deserted road. Then, as if it had made some kind of decision, the thing turned away from us and started moving again. Faster now, not quite running but a steady jog. It headed up the incline on the left side of the road and into the tree line. "Dude, did you see that?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "Drive," I said. "Get closer." Part of me was screaming to get the hell out of there, to turn around and speed back to town, but a stronger part, the part that needed to confirm what we'd just seen wasn't a hallucination, wanted to investigate. Jake eased the Explorer forward until we reached the spot where the creature had entered the woods. He pulled over to the side of the road and cut the engine. "Are you insane?" Trevor hissed. "What if it comes back?" "Just listen," I said. With the engine off and the windows down, the night sounds filled the car. Crickets, the distant rush of the Kettle River, the wind in the trees. And something else. Movement, heavy footsteps, branches breaking. It was moving up the slope through the underbrush. Then we heard it breathing, deep, heavy pants that no human could make. Occasionally there was a low grunt that made the hair on my arms stand up. We sat there, barely breathing ourselves, just listening to this thing move through the forest. After about a minute, the sound started getting fainter as it moved farther away. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The grunting, the footsteps, all of it just stopped. "It knows we're listening," Jake whispered, and I felt a chill run down my spine because I knew he was right. This thing was aware of us in a way no animal should be. That's when the smell hit us. I've read accounts of Sasquatch sightings where people mentioned the smell, but nothing prepared me for the reality of it. It was like fecal matter mixed with the stench of an unwashed body, but magnified 100 times, so powerful it made my eyes water. "Jesus Christ," Trevor gagged from the back seat. "What is that?" "Start the car," I said to Jake. "Now." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He turned the key and the engine roared to life. We sat there for a moment, still staring into the darkness of the tree line. Should we go after it?" Trevor asked, though his voice made it clear he wasn't actually volunteering. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Jake replied. "No way. We're getting out of here." He put the car in drive and started to pull away when we heard it. A loud crack like a branch breaking, coming from much closer than the last sounds. Something had moved nearer to us while we weren't listening. Jake floored it. The tires spun on the gravel for a second before catching, and we shot forward down the road. Nobody spoke for at least 5 minutes as we sped away from that spot, all of us constantly checking the rearview mirrors, as if expecting to see that thing running after us. Eventually, Jake broke the silence. "Did that really just happen? You saw it too, right?" I asked them both. "I'm not going crazy?" "We all saw it," Trevor confirmed, his voice steadier now that we were putting distance between us and whatever that thing was. That was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it." "Nobody's going to believe us," Jake said, and he was right. We debated going to the gas station as planned, but none of us felt like stopping anywhere. We just wanted to get back to Jake's house, lock the doors, and try to process what we'd seen. So we turned around at the next intersection and headed back, taking the main road instead of the river route. Back at Jake's place, we stayed up until dawn, replaying the encounter over and over, confirming details with each other to make sure we weren't exaggerating or misremembering anything. The height, definitely around 7 feet. The fur, dark brown, possibly black in places. The face, ape-like but with disturbingly human features. The way it moved, bipedal, fluid, deliberate. We swore to each other that we wouldn't tell anyone else about what we'd seen. Not because we were afraid of being ridiculed, though that was part of it, but because it felt like something sacred, something private, like we'd been granted a glimpse of something most people go their whole lives without seeing. Of course, that pact didn't last long. Within a week, we'd told a few close friends who predictably didn't believe us. Some thought we were pulling a prank. Others suggested we'd seen a bear and let our imaginations run wild. A couple even accused us of being drunk or high, which we weren't. After facing enough skepticism, we stopped talking about it publicly, but among ourselves, it became our thing. Even years later, whenever we get together, which isn't as often now that we've all moved away for college and jobs, we always toast to Bigfoot. It's our private joke, except it's not really a joke at all. About a year after our sighting, I was helping my uncle with some work on his property. He's friends with Old Man Peterson, who runs a cattle ranch about 10 miles from where we had our encounter. During lunch, my uncle mentioned that Peterson had been having trouble with something messing with his bone pit, the place where he disposes of livestock that die on his property. My ears perked up immediately, and I casually asked for more details. My uncle said Peterson had found large rocks scattered around the pit, rocks that would have been too heavy for a person to carry easily. At first, he thought it was local kids messing around. But then one evening, as he was heading back from the pit on his tractor, he claimed he had rocks thrown at him. I asked if he saw who threw them, trying to keep my voice neutral. My uncle chuckled and said, "This is where old Peterson goes off the deep end. Claims he saw some kind of ape man standing in the trees. Says it was huge, covered in fur. Can you believe that shit?" I could believe it. I believed every word. The detail that really got me, though, was what Peterson described next. He said, as he drove his tractor down the winding mountain road, this creature seemed to be following him, cutting through the woods to appear at different turns ahead of him, like it was studying him or escorting him off its territory. The area where we had our sighting has had rumors for years. Most locals dismiss them as campfire stories or tourism attempts, but there are enough accounts that match specific details of what we saw that I can't write them all off. There was the logger who quit his job after claiming he was being watched in the woods, the hiker who found strange, massive footprints along a remote trail and took plaster casts that mysteriously went missing from his garage, the highway patrolman who responded to a call about a bear attack, only to find a campsite destroyed in a way no bear would behave, with items carefully stacked in piles rather than scattered. I've done research since then. I've read books about Sasquatch sightings across the Pacific Northwest. I've joined online forums where people share their experiences, many of which echo our own in eerie ways. The height, the movement, the intelligence in the eyes, the overwhelming stench. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that creature turning to look at us burned into my mind, the way it assessed us, the intentionality behind its movements, the silence that fell when it realized we were listening. I don't camp anymore, I don't hike in remote areas, and I will never, ever drive that stretch of road along the Kettle River at night again. I know what's out there. I know that the forests of the Pacific Northwest hide things that most people will never see, things that maybe we're not meant to see. And sometimes, when I'm alone and it's quiet, I swear I can still smell that distinctive odor, just faintly. A reminder that some encounters leave a mark on you that never fully goes away. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Most people don't. But if you're ever driving through a remote stretch of Washington near the Canadian border and you see something tall moving among the trees, don't stop, don't cut your engine to listen. Just keep driving and count yourself lucky that it only watched you pass by, because whatever that thing was by the Kettle River, it's still out there. And not all encounters end with just a story to tell. Story 3. I've debated posting this for the longest time. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this out. It's been over 60 years since that night in 1962, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My name is Joe Gregg, and I used to drive buses for Pacific Stage Lines in British Columbia. What I experienced that rainy November night near Chilliwack in the Fraser Valley has haunted me my entire life. Most nights behind the wheel blurred together after a while. Different faces, same routes. But not that night. Never that night. I was tired. It had been a long shift, and I'd just dropped off a group of soldiers at the Canadian Armed Forces base. It was about 11:45 p.m., and all I wanted was to get back to the depot, clock out, and head home. The rain was coming down pretty steady. Not a downpour, but enough that I had the wipers going at a good clip. You know how the Fraser Valley gets in the fall, misty, dark, the kind of night where the headlights only seem to illuminate about 20 feet ahead of you. The road back was a winding stretch through some pretty dense woods. Not many streetlights out there, and the trees seemed to swallow what little light there was. I'd driven it hundreds of times, could probably navigate it with my eyes closed, though I never would, of course. I was the only vehicle out there that night, which wasn't unusual for that time. I remember I had the radio on low, some late-night program with static cutting in every few minutes. I was actually thinking about what I'd have for a midnight snack when I got home when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a really tall man wearing some kind of fur coat, standing at the edge of the road about 50 yards ahead, which was weird enough. Who would be out here, in the rain, at this hour? My first thought was maybe one of the soldiers had missed the bus and somehow beat me here by hitchhiking, but that didn't make any sense. I slowed down, not wanting to splash the guy. The bus headlights caught him in their glow, and that's when I realized something was very, very wrong. This wasn't a person in a coat. This was something else. It moved to cross the road, and I eased up on the brakes to watch it. The way it walked, and it wasn't human. The stride was too long, too fluid, almost like it was gliding with each step. I still had my high beams on, and in that moment, whatever it was turned and looked directly at me. My blood went cold. Its eyes caught the light and reflected back at me like an animal's, that greenish-yellow glow you see when a deer looks into your headlights. But these weren't deer eyes. They were set in what I can only describe as a face that was both human-like and not human at all. I instinctively flashed my lights, something I'd do to signal another driver. Why I did that, I'll never know. Maybe some part of me was still trying to process this as a normal encounter. When the lights flashed, the creature turned fully toward the bus, and I got my first real look at it. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget what I saw. It was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. It had shoulders wider than any football player I'd ever seen, and arms that hung down almost to its knees. The body was covered in dark, matted hair or fur that glistened in the rain. It wasn't wearing clothes. The fur was its covering. The face, I couldn't make out fine details from that distance, but it had a pronounced brow ridge and a flattened nose area. The jaw seemed heavy and powerful, but it was the sheer size and proportions that told me immediately this wasn't a human being. Nothing human is built like that. I'd guess it weighed at least 450 pounds, but it wasn't fat. It was solid, like a linebacker times 2. I had my foot hovering between the brake and gas pedal, frozen in indecision. Run? Stay? I didn't know what to do. The thing stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it did something that I still can't explain. It turned away from the road and, in one fluid motion, leaped up onto a large boulder on the side of the embankment. Not climbed, leaped. Like a cat jumping onto a counter, except this was a massive creature, jumping straight up at least 7 or 8 feet. The agility of it was wrong. Something that big shouldn't be able to move like that. It defied everything I thought I knew about physics and how bodies work. After it landed on the rock, it paused for a moment, looked back at me one more time, then disappeared into the tree line. I sat there in the idling bus, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, for at least 5 minutes. I couldn't move. My brain kept trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. A bear? No, bears don't stand and walk like that. A man in a costume, at midnight in the pouring rain, miles from anywhere. Who could jump that high? Eventually I put the bus in gear and drove past the spot, slowly. I didn't stop. I wasn't that brave or that stupid, but I marked the location in my mind. I drove back to the depot in a daze. The night dispatcher asked if I was feeling all right when I clocked out, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I just nodded and mumbled something about being tired. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not then. Who would believe me? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I called in sick, the only time I ever did that in my 15 years with the company. Instead of going to work, I drove my personal truck back out to that stretch of road. It was daytime now, and the spot looked so ordinary, so normal. But I found the boulder. I parked my truck and walked over to it, stood at the base and looked up. The top of that rock was 7 feet 10 inches from the ground. I measured it with a tape measure I'd brought along. I'm 5'10", and I couldn't even get halfway up it without scrambling. Whatever I saw the night before had jumped up there like it was nothing. I searched the area for any signs. Footprints, hair, anything. The rain had washed away most evidence, but near the tree line, I found what looked like a partial footprint in some mud. It was huge, easily 16 inches long, and deeper at one end than my boot print next to it, suggesting whatever made it was far heavier than my 180 pounds. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reflective eyes staring back at me. I kept the encounter to myself for almost a month. I was afraid, not just of the creature, but of what people would think if I told them. Finally, I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. I told my best friend Dave over beers one night. He listened carefully, then laughed and told me to cut back on the drinking. I tried telling my wife, and she got a worried look and asked if I was feeling all right, if maybe I should see a doctor. It was the same with everyone I told. Concern, disbelief, or outright mockery. So I stopped talking about it. But I never stopped thinking about it. I started reading everything I could find about similar sightings. This was before the internet, so information wasn't easy to come by. But I found newspaper clippings, magazine articles, books about wilderness encounters. I learned that what I saw had a name, Sasquatch, and that the Fraser Valley had a long history of sightings, especially from the local First Nations people who had their own names for the creature. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I'd seen was real. The descriptions matched. The height, the build, the way it moved, those reflective eyes. I wasn't crazy, and I hadn't been drinking. I saw something that night that shouldn't exist according to science, but it was as real as the bus I was driving. Over the years, I've gone back to that spot dozens of times. Never saw anything like it again. I've hiked deep into those woods, searching, hoping for another glimpse, some confirmation. Nothing. Just the quiet of the forest and the occasional curious look from hikers, wondering what an old man is doing out there alone. I'm 86 years old now. Most of the people who ridiculed me back then are gone. I've outlived my critics, I guess, but I know what I saw that night, and no amount of ridicule will ever make me change my mind. That thing, that Sasquatch, was real. It was powerful. It was intelligent. And the way it looked at me, there was awareness there. It wasn't just an animal. It knew I was watching it, and it decided to show me just a glimpse of what it was capable of before disappearing back into its world. I don't expect anyone reading this to believe me. That's not why I'm finally sharing my story. I'm sharing it because I'm old now, and I don't want this experience to die with me. I want there to be a record somewhere that on a rainy night in 1962, Joe Gregg, a simple bus driver, had an encounter with something extraordinary. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too, the human in the big metal box with the bright eyes, the one who stopped and watched instead of running away. I wonder if, somewhere deep in those woods, it's still out there, avoiding our roads and our cities, living a life we can barely imagine. I've never felt threatened by the memory. Awed, yes. Terrified in the moment, absolutely, but not threatened. Whatever it was, it could have easily approached the bus if it wanted to. It chose to show itself and then leave. That choice has always fascinated me. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, that's your choice. But I know what I saw that night. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night and the rain is coming down, I still find myself scanning the edges of the road, half hoping, half fearing that I'll see those eyes looking back at me one more time. Story 4. I still get chills when I think about what happened to me back in '62. Even as I type this, my hands are a bit shaky. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or fairy tales. Growing up in rural Canada, I've seen my fair share of wildlife, bears, cougars, you name it. I know what belongs in the woods and what doesn't. But what I saw that August day, well, it wasn't something that should exist in our world. My daughter Marianne and I had been planning this trip for months. She was 19 at the time, home from her first year of college, and I wanted to spend some quality time with her before she went back for her sophomore year. My husband couldn't join us, bad timing with work, so it was just us girls on a mother-daughter adventure. We headed about 250 miles north of the Okanagan region in British Columbia, between Quesnel and Prince George. It's beautiful country up there, pristine forests, crystal-clear creeks, and hardly any people, perfect for prospecting and fishing, which were my two favorite pastimes. I'd been coming to this region since I was a child myself, and I knew the area like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. We set up our camp on August 27th, a Monday. The weather was perfect, warm during the day, but cool enough at night to need a light blanket. The first 2 days were uneventful. We caught some nice rainbow trout, found a few promising spots for minerals, and just enjoyed being out in nature together. Marianne was telling me all about college life and her new boyfriend, and I was just soaking it all in, happy to have this time with her. On Wednesday, August 29th, everything changed. We woke up early, had a quick breakfast of bacon and coffee, and decided to split up for the morning. Marianne wanted to try fishing at a pond we'd discovered the previous day, while I wanted to check out a small creek about half a mile from our campsite, where I'd noticed some interesting rock formations that might contain copper. "Meet me at the creek around noon," I told her as we parted ways. "Bring something for lunch, and we can eat by the water." The morning went by quickly. I was focused on my prospecting, carefully examining rocks and occasionally using my small pickaxe to chip off samples. I'd found a few promising specimens and was feeling pretty good about the day. It was peaceful out there, just the sound of the creek, the occasional bird call, and my own thoughts. Around 1 p.m. I started to wonder where Marianne was. She was usually punctual, but I figured maybe she'd caught a good-sized fish and was taking her time bringing it in. I wasn't worried yet, just a bit hungry and ready for lunch. I had just knelt down to wash my hands in the creek when I heard a rustling noise behind me. Thinking it was Marianne finally arriving with our lunch, I turned around with a smile on my face. The smile froze and died instantly. Standing there no more than 10 yards away was something. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. It was standing upright on 2 legs like a human, but everything else about it was wrong. My first wild thought was that it was a man, a very tall man, with extraordinarily long arms that hung almost to its knees. But within a split second, I knew better. Pure instinct took over. I'd been hunting since I was a girl, and I'd brought my rifle with me that day like I always did in the wilderness. Before I even consciously decided to, I had raised my .30-30 Winchester and was aiming it directly at the creature's chest. My hands weren't shaking then. They were steady as a rock. When you're facing something like that, there's a strange calm that comes over you. It's like your body knows that panic will get you killed, so it just switches off the fear temporarily. That would come later. In that moment, I was just focused, alert, ready. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow ridge. Its face, God, I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It wasn't fully animal, but it sure wasn't human either. It had high cheekbones, a wide, flat nose that was almost flush with its face, and a sloped forehead that gave way to a crown of long, matted hair. The hair on its head was a dirty brown color, hanging down past its shoulders in tangled clumps. Its body was massive, broad shoulders, a barrel chest covered in lighter blonde hair, and those impossibly long arms with large hands. The legs were proportionally shorter, but still powerful-looking, covered in the same matted hair as the rest of its body. What struck me most was its expression. There was intelligence there, not human intelligence exactly, but something aware. It was looking at me with what I can only describe as curiosity mixed with caution. It opened its mouth slightly, revealing teeth that looked surprisingly human-like, though larger. I expected it to roar or make some kind of animal sound, but it was completely silent. We stayed locked in this standoff for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. My finger was on the trigger, and I know I could have shot it. But something held me back. Maybe it was the human-like quality to its gaze. Or maybe just the shock of encountering something I couldn't explain. Then I remembered Marianne. My daughter was somewhere nearby, possibly heading this way, completely unaware of what was waiting. That thought broke the strange spell between me and the creature. "Stay back," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I hadn't planned to speak. The words just came out. At the sound of my voice, the creature's expression changed. Its eyes widened slightly, and it took a half-step backward. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and leapt into the dense bushes to my right. There was a tremendous crashing sound as it moved through the underbrush, and then silence. I didn't lower my rifle. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I started backing away slowly, keeping the rifle aimed at the spot where the creature had disappeared. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to get back to camp as fast as possible, but I knew better. Running triggers a predator's chase instinct, so I backed away, one careful step at a time, my eyes darting between the bushes and the surrounding forest. That's when the feeling started, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? It was like that, but 100 times more intense. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything unusual, but I knew it was still there, following me, observing from the cover of the forest. I kept backing up until I reached a bend in the creek, then turned and started moving more quickly toward our campsite, still looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The feeling of being watched never subsided. When I was about halfway back to camp, I heard Marianne calling my name. Her voice sent a jolt of panic through me. "Mom, where are you? I brought sandwiches." "Marianne!" I shouted back, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm coming to you. Stay where you are." I found her standing near the trail that led to our camp, looking confused and holding a small bundle wrapped in wax paper. Our lunch. The relief at seeing her safe was so overwhelming I nearly dropped my rifle. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, noticing my expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't tell her, not right then. I didn't want to frighten her, and a part of me was already trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. No, that didn't explain the face, the proportions. A man in some kind of costume, out here, miles from anywhere. That made even less sense. "Nothing," I lied. "I thought I saw a bear, that's all. Let's get back to camp." I kept us moving at a brisk pace, my rifle ready the entire time. Marianne kept asking questions. She knew me too well to believe my bear story, but I deflected as best I could. All the while, that sensation of being watched followed us all the way back to our campsite. Once we were back at camp, I insisted we pack up immediately. "But we were supposed to stay until Saturday," Marianne protested. "That's 3 more days." "I know, honey, but I've got a bad feeling. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts out here." I could tell she was disappointed and confused, but she helped me pack up our gear. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see that creature emerge at any moment. The feeling of being observed never left. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on me. It took us about an hour to break camp and load everything into our truck. As we were finishing, Marianne suddenly stopped and looked toward the forest edge. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I froze, listening intently. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the wind in the trees and distant bird calls. Then I caught it. A sound like wood knocking against wood, coming from the direction of the creek where I'd seen the creature. Knock, 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 deliberate, rhythmic. "It's probably just a woodpecker," I said. but I knew it wasn't. Woodpeckers don't make such slow, measured sounds. The knocking continued as we got in the truck. I started the engine with shaking hands, throwing one last glance at the forest before putting the vehicle in gear and driving away much faster than was safe on those rough logging roads. Marianne was quiet for a while as we drove, then finally asked, "It wasn't a bear, was it?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, it wasn't a bear." "Then what was it?" I didn't answer immediately. How could I explain what I'd seen when I didn't understand it myself? Finally, I said, "I'm not sure. Something I've never seen before." "Like what?" she pressed. "Like something that shouldn't exist," I replied, and left it at that. We drove in silence for a long while after that. The further we got from that place, the more my rational mind tried to dismiss what I'd seen. But I couldn't shake the memory of those intelligent eyes staring into mine, the bizarre mix of human and animal features, the way it moved with both power and grace. That night, after we checked into a motel in Prince George, I finally told Marianne everything. To her credit, she didn't laugh or dismiss my story. She listened carefully, asking questions now and then. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what it sounds like, don't you?" she finally said. I nodded. "Sasquatch, Bigfoot, but those are just stories, legends." "Maybe not," she replied. "Maybe they're based on something real." In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a bear, or maybe some kind of hallucination brought on by the isolation and the wilderness. But deep down, I knew better. I've seen bears my whole life. I know what they look like, how they move. This was something else entirely. I never reported my experience to any authorities. Who would believe me? A middle-aged woman claiming to have seen a Sasquatch in the British Columbia wilderness. They'd think I was crazy or attention-seeking, so I kept it to myself, telling only my husband and daughter. It's been years now since that day in August 1962. I've never gone back to that specific area, though I've continued to fish and prospect in other parts of British Columbia. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I get that same feeling of being watched, and my mind goes right back to that creek bank and those intelligent, inhuman eyes. I know what I saw. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal known to science. Whatever it was intelligent enough to understand that I was a threat with my rifle. It chose to retreat rather than attack, and it followed us, watching from a distance, all the way back to our camp. To this day, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, the image of that creature vividly clear in my mind. I've read about other Sasquatch sightings since then, and many describe similar features to what I saw. The height, the posture, the facial structure. All I know for certain is this. There are things in the wilderness that we don't understand, things that don't fit neatly into our categories of what should or shouldn't exist. I saw one of those things on a creek bank in British Columbia, and it saw me too, and sometimes I still feel like it's watching me, even now, decades later, hundreds of miles away. Story 5. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. I'm typing this with sweaty hands because even though it happened 25 years ago, I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. I'm 39 now, but I was just 14 when it happened. It was November 1997, and my dad and I were on our annual hunting trip in northern Arkansas. We'd been looking forward to it for months. Dad worked at a steel plant back then, and I was in my freshman year of high school. These hunting trips were our thing, just us men in the woods, as he liked to say. That year, we'd gotten permission to hunt on this huge piece of land owned by Mid-South Mining Corporation. It was basically untouched wilderness in the Ozark foothills, miles of dense forest and rocky terrain that hadn't seen much human activity. Dad knew someone who worked for the company who'd hooked us up with access. We'd set up our little camp that morning, Nothing fancy, just a tent and a fire pit. The plan was to hunt separate areas about half a mile apart and meet back at camp before sunset. Dad had his old Winchester rifle, the one his father had given him. I had my Remington 243 that I'd gotten for my birthday the year before. Not the most powerful gun, but enough for deer. The morning hunt had been quiet. I'd seen some tracks, but no deer. Around 3 p.m., I decided to move to a new spot, closer to this small valley that Dad had pointed out on the map. The weather was perfect for hunting. Cool but not cold. Maybe mid-40s, with barely any wind. The sun was starting to get lower, casting this orange-gold light through the trees that made everything look different, almost like it was glowing. I remember checking my watch. It was 4:17 p.m. That's when I heard the shots. 3 of them spaced out. Boom, boom, boom. Dad's Winchester had a distinctive sound that I'd recognize anywhere. The shots came from maybe half a mile west of me, in the direction of a small hollow. I wasn't concerned at first. 3 shots most likely meant he'd spotted a deer, but something felt off about the timing between shots. Too deliberate. Dad was a good shot. He wouldn't need 3 attempts unless something unusual was happening. I waited a few minutes expecting to hear him on our walkie-talkies, but there was nothing. So I decided to head in that direction. Not running, just walking with purpose through the woods. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile when I started hearing voices. At least that's what my brain first registered them as. But they weren't normal. Not at all. They were garbled, rapid, like someone talking through a fan or underwater. The pitch wasn't right either. Too deep, then suddenly too high. And there was this clicking or chattering sound mixed in. My first thought was that maybe someone else was hunting in the area with radios, and I was picking up interference or something. But I wasn't using my walkie-talkie, and these sounds weren't electronic. They were coming from the forest ahead of me. I slowed down, suddenly aware of my heartbeat in my ears. The forest had gotten quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but those sounds. I crouched and moved forward more carefully, my rifle ready. The hollow was ahead of me. A small depression in the land with thicker vegetation. The sun was hitting it at an angle, creating long shadows. The garbled voices were coming from there, but they'd gotten quieter, more like murmurs. I was maybe 50 yards from the edge of the thicket when everything went to hell. The underbrush exploded. I mean, literally burst apart as 2 massive things came charging out. I froze, completely froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. They were on all 4s at first, moving like gorillas, but much, much bigger. Their shoulders had to be 4 feet off the ground. Their limbs were long, powerful, covered in this reddish-brown fur that hung in strands, almost like moss. When the sunlight hit them, the fur looked almost reddish-orange, but their faces... God, their faces. They were flat and wide, with dark eyes set deep under heavy brow ridges. Not like a bear or any animal I'd ever seen. The eyes were too knowing, too aware. They stopped about 30 yards from me, rising to a half-standing position. That's when they started making those sounds again, that rapid chattering and clicking. They were communicating, actually talking to each other. One of them, the larger one, turned its head and looked directly at me. I'll never forget that moment. It wasn't an animal looking at me. It was something else, something that was thinking and assessing. Pure panic hit me. I raised my rifle and fired without aiming. The shot went wide, but the sound was enough. They both dropped to all 4s and took off up the opposite ridge. The speed was incredible. Nothing that big should move that fast. They covered ground like they weighed nothing, leaping over fallen trees and rocks. Within seconds they were gone, vanishing over the ridge. I stood there, shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle. My mouth was dry and I felt sick to my stomach. What the hell had I just seen? After a minute or 2 I remembered my dad. Oh God, Dad, those shots. He'd seen them too. I yelled for him, "Dad! Dad!" My voice cracked like I was 10 years old again. Nothing. I started moving toward where I'd heard the shots, but I kept looking behind me, terrified those things would come back. The forest seemed different now, threatening, alive with hidden dangers. Every shadow might be hiding one of those creatures. I found my dad about 10 minutes later. He was sitting on a fallen tree, his rifle across his knees, staring at the ground. He looked up when he heard me approaching, and his face— I'd never seen my dad look like that. Pale, sweaty, his eyes wide. "Caleb," he said when he saw me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you see them?" I nodded, unable to speak at first. Then it all came tumbling out. What I'd seen, the sounds they made, how they moved. Dad listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally. When I finished, he took a deep breath. "I shot at them," he said. 3 times, missed every shot. They were looking at something on the ground, examining it like people would. "What were they?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. Dad shook his head. "Couldn't have been bears, wrong shape, wrong movement. Couldn't have been wolves or coyotes. Too big." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Dad stood up suddenly. "We need to get back to camp. Pack up. We're leaving." "Now? But it'll be dark soon. Now, Caleb. We're not staying here tonight." We practically ran back to camp, packed everything in record time, and were in Dad's truck before the sun fully set. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Dad kept checking the rearview mirror, and I kept imagining those things following us, running alongside the road just beyond the reach of the headlights. That night, back home, Dad and I tried to convince ourselves we'd seen some kind of unusual bears, or maybe even oversized feral dogs. But we both knew that wasn't true. What we'd seen were Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them, 2 of them in the Arkansas wilderness. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those eyes, that awareness, and those sounds they made to each other. That wasn't animal communication. They were talking, actually talking. Dad never mentioned the incident again after that winter. It was like he locked it away. He stopped hunting completely the following year, saying his knees were getting bad. I knew better. The thing that still haunts me most wasn't just seeing them, it was that communication between them, the way they moved with purpose. And the worst thought of all, what Dad had said about them examining something on the ground. What were they looking at? What were they doing there? And the chattering, clicking language. Were there more of them beyond the ridge? Was this some kind of scouting party? I'm 39 years old now. I've never gone back to that hollow. Never hunted in those woods again. I tried researching similar encounters in that area years later, but found nothing concrete. Mid-South Mining ended up closing off that entire section of land for environmental remediation in 2001. Maybe they knew something. I don't talk about this. My wife knows something happened on a hunting trip that scared me, but not the details. How do you tell someone you saw creatures that aren't supposed to exist, that you heard them talking to each other in a language that no human throat could produce? I still dream about them sometimes. Those eyes watching me from the forest, that reddish fur glowing in the late afternoon sun, and that horrible garbled chattering that sounded almost like words. I don't know what we encountered that day. I don't want to know. But I'm absolutely certain of one thing. We weren't alone in those woods. And whatever was there with us wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something else. Something that thinks. Something that communicates, something that watches, and the thought that keeps me up some nights, even after all these years. What if they're still out there? What if they remember the boy who shot at them? What if they're watching and waiting, just beyond the edge of the lights? I haven't set foot in an Arkansas forest since November 1997, and I never will again. Story 6. I've never shared this story online before, even though it's been over 40 years since it happened. I guess it's time to finally get it off my chest. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and honestly, part of me worries people will just think I'm making this up. But I swear on everything I care about, what happened that summer night in 1981 was real. I was 16 that summer, just a kid looking forward to a couple weeks away from home, staying with family friends. The Bradleys had just bought this new farm property near Alder Creek in southwest Washington, not far from the Cascade foothills. It was a pretty sweet setup, about 80 acres with a brand new farmhouse, surrounded by thick timber on all sides. They had electric fencing around the pastures for their animals and a smaller, regular fence closer to the house. My parents arranged for me to stay with them for 2 weeks in late June, early July. I was excited because their nephew Travis was going to be there too. He was about my age, and we'd met a few times before at family gatherings. The plan was simple: fish in the creek, explore the property, maybe help out with some farm chores, and just enjoy being away from parents and school for a while. When I first arrived, Mr. Bradley picked me up from the bus station in his old pickup truck. During the drive to their place, he told me all about their new property, how they'd only moved in about 3 months earlier, how they were still getting used to the quiet after living closer to town for years. The farm was pretty isolated, with the nearest neighbor about 2 miles away. "You boys are gonna have a good time," he told me. "Just stay out of trouble, and don't wander too far into the woods without letting us know where you're heading." I remember noticing their German shepherd puppy Duke when we pulled up to the house. He was only about 6 months old, but already getting big, all ears and paws he hadn't grown into yet. He ran up to greet us, barking excitedly. Mrs. Bradley joked that he was their early warning system, since he barked at literally everything that came near the property. Delivery trucks, wild animals, even leaves blowing across the yard sometimes. The farm itself was nice. The house still had that new smell, and the Bradleys seemed proud of what they'd built. Travis and I were given a room on the second floor with twin beds. It had this big window overlooking part of the backyard and the edge of the forest beyond their property. I remember thinking how dark it got at night without any streetlights or neighbors nearby. The first few days were exactly what you'd expect from a summer vacation. We fished in the creek, caught some decent trout, helped Mr. Bradley repair a section of fence, and explored parts of the property. Travis knew more about the area than I did, but neither of us ventured too deep into the surrounding woods. There was plenty to do closer to the house. I should mention that I'd been into Bigfoot stories for a while at that point. I'd read books about supposed sightings in the Pacific Northwest, seen that famous Patterson-Gimlin film footage they always showed on TV specials about unexplained mysteries. I even had a subscription to some newsletter about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. But it was just an interest, you know, like some kids are into aliens or ghost stories. I never really expected to experience anything weird myself. We never talked about Bigfoot or anything like that during my stay. It wasn't on my mind at all. The Bradley farm was just a normal place. New buildings, cleared land for pastures. Nothing particularly spooky about it except how quiet it got at night. The incident happened on my 5th night there. Travis and I had spent most of the day helping Mr. Bradley stack firewood for the coming winter. We were exhausted by dinner time, and after watching some TV with the family, we headed up to bed around 10:30. I remember Mrs. Bradley making a joke about us actually going to bed at a reasonable hour for once. Our bedroom was directly above the back porch. The window was probably about 5.5 feet off the ground from the outside. I know because Mr. Bradley had mentioned needing a ladder to paint that section of the house a few weeks earlier. It wasn't that late in the summer yet, but it was warm enough that we kept the window cracked open at night. I fell asleep almost immediately. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, probably between 2 and 3 a.m., based on what happened later. But something had pulled me out of a deep sleep. At first, I was just disoriented, not sure why I was suddenly awake. The room was dark except for a bit of moonlight coming through the window. It took me a few seconds to realize what had woken me. There was breathing outside our window, deep, heavy breathing. Not like a person who'd been running or exercising. This was different. It was slow, deliberate, and raspy, like something with very large lungs taking deep, controlled breaths. And it was loud enough to hear clearly even though our window was only cracked a few inches. My first irrational thought was that someone had put a ladder up to our window and was standing there breathing. But that made no sense. Who would do that? And why? I remember lying completely still, trying to convince myself I was just hearing the wind or maybe an animal of some kind. But I knew it wasn't either of those things. The breathing had a pattern to it, in and out, in a way that could only come from a living creature. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds, I heard Travis whisper from his bed across the room. "Marcus? You awake?" I whispered back. "Yeah. Do you hear that?" "Outside the window," he said. It wasn't a question. We both just lay there, completely frozen. I don't think I've ever been more terrified in my life than in those moments. The breathing continued, steady and uninterrupted. Whatever was out there, it was right up against our window. And based on the height of that window from the ground, it had to be tall. Really tall. Neither of us moved. I couldn't have gotten out of bed if I wanted to. My body just wouldn't respond. It was like all my muscles had locked up. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the thing outside could hear it. The breathing went on for what must have been about 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. I remember noticing this weird, musky smell coming through the cracked window, something I'd never smelled before. Kind of like wet dog, but stronger and more wild, I guess. Then something happened that finally broke the spell. The old mantel clock downstairs in the living room started chiming. It was one of those antique clocks that chimed on the hour, and the sound carried through the quiet house. The moment the first chime rang out, the breathing just stopped. Not gradually, not like something moving away. It just instantly ceased. There was a very faint sound, like shifting weight on the ground below, and then nothing. Travis and I stayed frozen for at least another minute before either of us dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" he finally whispered. "I don't know," I said, "but it was right outside the window." We were both shaking. Eventually, Travis got up the courage to turn on the bedside lamp. The sudden light made the room feel a little safer, but neither of us wanted to look out the window. "Should we wake up your aunt and uncle?" I asked. Travis hesitated. "Let's check outside first. Maybe it was just, I don't know, a deer or something." Even as he said it, we both knew it wasn't a deer. No deer breathes like that, and no deer stands nearly 6 feet tall. We crept downstairs, trying not to wake the Bradleys. I remember my legs feeling like jelly with each step. When we got to the kitchen, Travis grabbed a flashlight from a drawer. We stood by the back door for a long time, neither of us wanting to be the first to open it. "We should check on Duke," Travis finally said. That's when I realized I hadn't heard the dog barking at all. Duke barked at everything. He should have been going crazy if something was outside the house. But there hadn't been a single bark. We cautiously opened the back door. The porch light was off, so Travis flipped it on before we stepped outside. The yard was empty and still. Duke was nowhere to be seen. "Duke!" Travis called, not too loudly. "Here, boy." No response. We stepped off the porch and shined the flashlight around the yard. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. Travis directed the beam of light at the ground beneath our bedroom window. The dirt there was hard-packed from people walking around the house, but I could swear there was a depression in the ground, like something heavy had been standing there. We didn't see any distinct footprints, though. "Duke!" Travis called again, a bit louder this time. We heard a whimpering sound coming from under the porch. Travis got down on his hands and knees and shined the light underneath. There was Duke, pressed as far back against the foundation as he could get, shaking like a leaf. "Come here, boy," Travis said gently. Duke wouldn't budge. His eyes were wide, and he just kept making this low, whimpering sound that gave me chills. "He's terrified," I whispered. Travis tried coaxing him out for a few more minutes, but Duke wasn't moving. Whatever had scared him, he was still afraid it might be out there. We looked around the yard some more, but didn't find anything conclusive. No strange footprints, no broken branches, nothing that would explain what we'd heard. But the fact that Duke, who normally would challenge anything that came near the property, was hiding and trembling, told us everything we needed to know. Something had been there, something that scared a German shepherd so badly he hid instead of barking. We finally went back inside, leaving the porch light on. Neither of us suggested going back to bed. Instead, we sat at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing out the windows, and waited for dawn. We didn't talk much about what we'd heard. It was like discussing it might somehow make it more real, or maybe bring it back. When Mrs. Bradley came downstairs around 6 a.m., she found us sitting there. She asked why we were up so early, and Travis just said we couldn't sleep. We didn't tell her what happened. I think we were both afraid she wouldn't believe us, or worse, that she would, and then everyone would be scared. The strange thing is, after that night, Travis and I barely discussed it. It's like we had this unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. Duke eventually came out from under the porch later that morning when Mr. Bradley called him, but he stayed close to the house all day and seemed jumpy. I stayed for the rest of my planned visit, but things felt different. Travis and I were both on edge, especially at night. We kept the window firmly closed despite the heat, and neither of us slept well. Nothing else happened during my stay, but the memory of that breathing never went away. After that summer, Travis and I kind of lost touch. His family moved to another state the following year, and this was long before social media or cell phones made it easy to stay connected. I've often wondered if he remembers that night as vividly as I do. I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to come up with rational explanations for what happened. Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs? Maybe. But bears don't typically just stand in one spot, breathing for 5 minutes, and they certainly don't stand 5-6 feet tall without making other noises. A person playing a prank. But who would know we were in that specific room, and who could breathe that loudly without giving themselves away? The more I've thought about it, the more convinced I've become that what was outside our window that night was a Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I know. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were exaggerating or making it up entirely. But I was there. I heard it breathing. I smelled that strange, musky odor. I saw how terrified Duke was. A dog bred to be protective, hiding and shaking instead of defending his territory. The Pacific Northwest has more Bigfoot sightings than anywhere else in the country. The area around the Cascades, with its dense forests and remote locations, has a long history of reported encounters. I never expected to be one of those people with a story to tell, but here I am, 4 decades later, still unable to explain what happened that night. I haven't been back to that area since that summer. I don't know if the Bradleys ever experienced anything strange after I left. Part of me has always wanted to reach out to Travis and ask if he ever told anyone else about what happened, or if he's come to any conclusions about what we heard. All I know for certain is that something was outside that window that night. Something tall enough to reach a second-story window, something that breathed like no animal I've ever heard, something that terrified a guard dog into hiding instead of barking. Whatever it was real, and all these years later I still get chills remembering the sound of that breathing in the dark. Story 7. I've gone back and forth about posting this for years now. I'm not looking for fame or to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest. Every time I close my eyes at night, I still see those eyes looking back at me. It happened on August 17th, 2015. I remember the date exactly because I'd taken a Monday off work specifically to go hiking alone, something I rarely got to do with my work schedule. I live in Virginia, and Giles County has some beautiful trails that most tourists don't know about. There's this one waterfall spot I'd heard about from a co-worker, and I figured it would be the perfect place to clear my head. The day started normal enough. I woke up early, around 5:30, packed a small lunch, filled 2 water bottles, and drove about an hour to reach the trailhead. It was already getting hot. One of those muggy Virginia summer days where you're drenched in sweat before you even start hiking. By 9 a.m., I was already sweating through my t-shirt. The trail wasn't marked very well, which is probably why it wasn't crowded. I only passed 2 other hikers on my way in, an older couple who were heading back to the parking lot. They mentioned something about the trail getting overgrown further ahead, but I didn't think much of it. After they left, I didn't see another person. The trail gradually became more narrow, with thick laurel bushes closing in on both sides. The leaves were so dense that in some spots it felt like walking through a tunnel of green. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just the sound of birds and my boots on the dirt path. Around 11 a.m., I took a quick break to drink some water and check my phone. No service, which was expected. I was about a mile from the new river, though I couldn't see it from where I was. According to my map, the waterfall was just another 20 minutes ahead. The sun was directly overhead, making patches of bright light break through the tree canopy. It was hot, probably around 90 degrees. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead and feeling it run down my back. I should have brought a hat. I continued walking, and the trail started to slope downward toward what I assumed was the waterfall area. The laurel thickets got even thicker, limiting visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. I could hear the water now, that distant rushing sound that tells you you're getting close. At exactly 11:30, I checked my watch because I was timing how long it would take to reach the falls. I rounded a slight bend in the trail and stopped to get my bearings. The path split, with one fork continuing down toward the sound of water and another veering off to the right, climbing up a small rise in the ground. That's when I saw it. I almost missed it at first because it was partially hidden behind that small hill on the right side of the trail. From where I was standing, and I've measured this distance countless times in my head, it was about 24 feet away. Close enough that I could see details I wish I couldn't remember so clearly. I could only see from mid-chest up because of the rise in the ground, but what I saw was enough to freeze me completely. It was tall, much taller than a man. Standing behind that small hill, its chest was still visible. If it had been standing on level ground with me, I'm certain it would have been over 7 feet tall, maybe even 8. The first thing that registered was the hair, a reddish-brown color that reminded me of an old copper penny that's been in circulation too long. Not bright red, but not dark brown either. The hair on top of its head was shorter, maybe 2-3 inches, but it grew progressively longer down its body. On its chest and shoulders, the hair was thin but uniform, around 5 inches long. What struck me as odd was its arms. The right arm was slightly extended away from its body, with a bend at the elbow, and the hair there was much longer, hanging down maybe 18 inches, almost like the sleeves of hair you see on orangutans at the zoo. But this wasn't an orangutan, not even close. Its face, God, its face is what keeps me up at night. It wasn't covered in the same thick hair as its body. Instead, it had lighter-colored hair, almost like a beard, but not nearly as dense as the body hair. The face wasn't pushed forward like a gorilla's or chimp's. It was flatter, more human-like, but not human. The nose was broad and flat. No ears were visible from where I stood, or at least none that protruded from the hair. But the eyes, those eyes, they were brown, not black or dark like most wildlife, but a lighter brown with whites visible all around. They were wide open, and I swear they showed the same shock I was feeling. Those eyes looked me up and down, taking me in just as I was taking it in. It seemed surprised, not aggressive, not threatening, just startled to see me there, as if I was the one who didn't belong. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. Probably only a few seconds, but it felt like minutes. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think clearly. It was like my brain was trying to process something it had no category for. What happened next is the part I play over and over in my head, wondering if I could have done something differently. The creature blinked, a slow, deliberate blink, and then it moved. Not toward me, thankfully. It took a single step backward, still keeping its eyes locked on mine. There was no sound of breaking branches or crunching leaves. It moved with an eerie silence that seemed impossible for something so large. I remember my legs starting to shake, not from fear exactly, but from the adrenaline that was flooding my system. I had the overwhelming urge to run, but some primal part of my brain kept me rooted to the spot. Don't run, don't make sudden movements, don't show fear. These thoughts crashed through my mind like emergency broadcasts. Then I did something stupid. I shifted my weight to reach for my phone in my pocket. I needed proof of what I was seeing. The moment I moved, the creature's demeanor changed. Its head tilted slightly and its right arm lowered. It wasn't an aggressive move, but it was deliberate, like it was deciding what to do about me. Before I could get my phone out, it turned with surprising speed and disappeared into the laurel thicket behind it. There was barely any sound, just a soft rustle of leaves, nothing like what you'd expect from something that size moving through dense undergrowth. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where it had been, half expecting it to reappear. My mouth was dry, my hands were trembling. My t-shirt was soaked through, not just with sweat now, but with a cold, clammy fear that made me feel sick to my stomach. "Hello?" I finally called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Of course, there was no answer. Just the distant sound of the waterfall and birds chirping, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. I should have left immediately. Any rational person would have turned around and headed straight back to their car. But I wasn't thinking rationally. I was in a state of shock, and part of me needed to confirm what I'd seen was real. So I did something incredibly stupid. I walked toward the spot where it had been standing. The ground there was soft, with patches of moss and fallen leaves. I looked for footprints but found nothing definitive, just some disturbed vegetation and what might have been a slight depression in the moss. The laurel thicket it had disappeared into was dense, too dense for me to follow without a machete. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, scanning the surrounding forest and listening intently. The woods felt different now. What had seemed peaceful just moments before now felt watchful, alive in a way I hadn't noticed earlier. I had the distinct feeling I was being observed, though from where, I couldn't say. That feeling of being watched is what finally broke my paralysis. I turned and walked back to the main trail, trying to maintain a normal pace despite every instinct screaming at me to run. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see those eyes again if it was still there, watching me leave. The hike back to my car was a blur. I remember checking over my shoulder constantly, jumping at every sound, and moving much faster than I had on the way in. What should have been an hour-long hike took me maybe 40 minutes. By the time I reached my car, my legs were burning from the exertion, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I sat in my car for a long time, with the doors locked, trying to process what I'd seen. The rational part of my brain tried to find explanations. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. No, the proportions were all wrong. And the face, that face wasn't a bear's. A man in a costume, in 90-degree heat, a mile from the nearest road, in an area barely visited by hikers. It made no sense. When I finally started driving home, my hands were still shaking so badly I had to pull over twice to compose myself. I kept seeing those eyes in my mind, intelligent, surprised, aware. They weren't the eyes of an animal, but they weren't human either. I didn't tell anyone what I saw for almost a week. How could I? I knew how it would sound, but the experience ate away at me until I finally confided in my brother, who's always been interested in cryptozoology. He was the one who told me what I already suspected, but was afraid to acknowledge that what I'd described matched countless reports of Sasquatch sightings. I've spent the last few years trying to make sense of what happened that day. I've read every book, article, and forum post I could find on Sasquatch sightings. I've gone back to that trail 3 times, always with someone else, always with a camera ready. I never saw it again. Some days I almost convinced myself it was a hallucination, heat stroke or dehydration playing tricks on my mind. But then I remember those eyes looking directly into mine, that moment of mutual recognition, and I know it was real. I don't expect anyone here to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if someone else told me this story. All I know is that on August 17, 2015, at 11:30 a.m. on a hot summer day in Giles County, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist according to science, but that I know with absolute certainty does exist. I still hike regularly. I still love the outdoors, but I never go alone anymore. And I always have the feeling that I'm being watched when I'm in the woods. Not in a threatening way, just observed, studied, the same way it studied me during those few breathless seconds we shared. Whatever it was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some undiscovered species of primate, it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. And in that moment of mutual surprise, there was something like recognition, a sentient awareness that has haunted me ever since. I don't have proof. I wish I'd gotten that photo, but maybe it's better that I didn't. Some things in this world are meant to remain mysteries, glimpsed only briefly before disappearing back into the shadows of our collective imagination. But I know what I saw, and on quiet nights when I close my eyes, I can still see those intelligent brown eyes looking back at me, filled with the same question I was asking. What are you? Story 8. I still get uneasy talking about what happened during that camping trip near Mount St. Helens back in 2003. I've been a detective with the Portland PD for almost 20 years now, and I've seen some shit that would turn most people's stomachs. But nothing in my career has left me as deeply unsettled as what happened that night in Gifford Pinchot. It was supposed to be a guys' weekend. 10 of us, all either cops, detectives, or ex-military, decided to go camping up on the western slope of the Cascades, the kind of trip where we could drink beer, tell stories, and get away from the job for a couple days. My buddy Mike organized it. He knew this remote spot off an unmarked Forest Service road that was perfect for a larger group. We all arrived Friday afternoon in separate vehicles. It took about 3 hours from Portland, the last hour on increasingly rough roads. I remember thinking how isolated it felt as I followed Mike's truck in my Explorer, watching the trees get thicker and the civilization get sparser. The campsite was beautiful, a natural clearing surrounded by old-growth forest with a partial view of Mount St. Helens in the distance. We set up our tents in a rough circle around what would be our fire pit. Everyone except me had brought tents. I'd planned to just throw my sleeping bag in the back of my Explorer if the weather turned. That first afternoon was exactly what we needed. We got a fire going, broke out the coolers, and started grilling. The 10 of us sat around shooting the shit like guys do. Most of us knew each other from work or through mutual friends, but a few were meeting for the first time. Looking back, it seems important to emphasize, these weren't jittery civilians. Every man there had either served in the military, law enforcement, or both. Guys who had seen combat, worked homicide, faced down armed suspects. Not the type to spook easily. After dinner, we kept drinking around the fire, swapping stories and giving each other shit. Mike had brought along a bottle of good whiskey, and we passed it around as the night got darker and colder. Around 10:30, some of the guys started turning in. By midnight, only 4 of us were still awake. Me, Jeff, another detective from my precinct, Dave, ex-Army Ranger who now worked for the Sheriff's Department, and Ray, a state trooper. The fire had died down to embers, and we were talking in that hushed way you do when you don't want to wake up the rest of camp. The forest around us was pitch black, no moon that night, just millions of stars overhead, the kind of darkness you only get when you're miles from the nearest light bulb. It was about 12:30 a.m. when we heard it. A sound came from the ridge to the north of us. A vocalization is the only way I can describe it. Deep, resonant, and loud. It started low and then rose in pitch, lasting maybe 3-4 seconds. It wasn't an elk bugle or a wolf howl. I've heard both plenty of times. This was different, more structured, almost like it had syllables. The four of us froze mid-conversation. Dave was the first to speak. What the fuck was that? Before any of us could answer, the sound was answered by another call from the opposite side of camp. Same tone, same pattern, but slightly different at the end, like a response. "Those aren't bears," Ray whispered, reaching down to where his service weapon sat in its holster next to his chair. I remember feeling suddenly very sober. Could be hunters messing with us, I suggested, not believing it myself. We were miles from anywhere, on an unmarked road, in a spot that wasn't on any map. We listened for more sounds, but nothing came. Eventually, we stoked up the fire again, and nobody mentioned leaving, but nobody went to bed either. We kept talking, but the conversation was stilted now, all of us listening more than speaking. Around 1:30 a.m., Ray and Dave finally headed to their tents, saying they needed some sleep. Jeff and I stayed up, neither of us saying the obvious, that neither of us wanted to sleep in a tent after what we'd heard. That's when the clicking started. It was subtle at first, just a series of soft, rhythmic clicking sounds coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. It reminded me of someone rapidly tapping their fingernails on wood. Then small stones started landing near the picnic table where Jeff and I were sitting. Not thrown hard, just tossed, like someone getting our attention. "You see anything?" I asked Jeff, who was facing the direction the sounds were coming from. He shook his head, his hand resting on his hip near his gun. "I'm going to take a look." I grabbed my mag light, the big police issue one that doubles as a club in a pinch, and Jeff pulled his out too. We stood up and directed the beams toward where we thought the sounds were coming from. Nothing, just trees and underbrush and darkness. We did a slow 360 around the campsite, our lights cutting through the dark. The clicking had stopped while we were looking, which somehow made it worse. Like whatever made the sound knew we were searching for it. After about 10 minutes, we sat back down at the table. "I'm sleeping in my Explorer tonight," I told Jeff. "Think I'll join you if that's okay," he replied. "Don't like the idea of being in a tent right now." We sat in silence for a while longer. The fire was dying again, and neither of us moved to feed it. That's when we heard the footsteps, something walking in the woods just beyond the clearing, not trying to be stealthy. Heavy steps on dried pine needles and twigs, circling the camp. The footsteps made a complete circuit around us, just out of sight in the trees. Then silence again. Jeff and I hadn't said a word the entire time, just listening, our eyes straining to see into the darkness. The fire was just embers now. "Let's get in your truck," Jeff finally said. "I've got my sleeping bag in my tent, but fuck that." I handed him the emergency blanket I keep in my Explorer, and we both climbed in, locking the doors. I reclined my seat as far as it would go, and Jeff did the same in the passenger seat. Neither of us slept much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, thinking I heard those clicking sounds again, or feeling like something was watching the vehicle. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As the first grey light filtered through the trees, I saw Jeff was already awake, staring out the windshield. "You sleep at all?" I asked him. "Maybe an hour," he said. "You?" I shook my head. We got out of the Explorer, and I noticed how unusually quiet it was. No birdsong, no squirrels rustling in the trees. Just dead silence except for some of the guys starting to stir in their tents. Mike emerged from his tent, looking rested and cheerful. "Morning, gentlemen. Who's ready for coffee?" I remember thinking how strange it was that he seemed so normal, so unaffected. Then I realized he hadn't heard what we heard. He'd been asleep. As Mike got the camp stove going for coffee, a few more guys emerged from their tents. Dave and Ray looked as tired as Jeff and I felt. The other guys were joking around, complaining about sleeping on the ground, normal morning camp stuff. I pulled Dave aside while Mike was making coffee. "You hear anything else after you went to your tent?" Dave glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "Footsteps all around my tent, for at least an hour. You?" I nodded and told him about the clicking and the stones. By now, 7 of us were gathered near the picnic table waiting for coffee. Mike was telling some story about a fishing trip, but I wasn't really listening. I was scanning the tree line, looking for, I don't know what, signs of whatever had been circling our camp. That's when we heard the voices. They came from the dense tree line, about 50 yards from camp. Not English, not any language I recognized. The sounds were guttural, rhythmic, almost like chanting, but with conversation-like patterns, rising and falling tones, pauses, responses, at least 2 distinct sources, maybe more. Everyone shut up instantly. Mike stopped mid-sentence, the coffee pot frozen in his hand. "What the fuck is that?" one of the guys whispered. No one answered. We all just stood there, listening. The voices continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Here's the thing that still bothers me the most. There were 10 of us. All law enforcement or military veterans, all armed. Most of us had our service weapons, and a couple guys had brought hunting rifles. We were not helpless campers in a horror movie. But not one of us, not a single one, suggested we go investigate those voices. Not one of us even moved in that direction. Something in our gut, in our instincts, told us to stay put, that whatever was in those trees was not something we wanted to confront. After the voices stopped, the normal forest sounds slowly returned. Birds started singing again. The tension eased slightly, but nobody was relaxing. "Probably just other hikers," Mike suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yeah, hikers speaking what? Klingon?" Ray said. "Could be a foreign language," someone else offered. "Maybe some international students on a hike." But we all knew that was bullshit. We were miles from any trail, in a spot only accessible by 4-wheel drive vehicles, which none of us had seen on the way in. And those voices, they weren't any human language I'd ever heard. We ate breakfast in near silence, everyone jumpy and looking over their shoulders. The guys who hadn't been awake for the night, sounds tried to keep the mood light, but even they picked up on the unease. After breakfast, we split into groups. Some guys went fishing at a nearby stream. Others stayed in camp to play cards. Jeff, Dave, Ray, and I went for a hike, though what we were really doing was searching the perimeter of camp for any signs of what we'd heard. We found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no evidence anyone or anything had been there. The ground was mostly covered in pine needles, which didn't hold prints well. We expanded our search a bit further into the woods, but still nothing. When we got back to camp, the mood had lightened somewhat. The day was sunny and warm, and it's hard to stay scared in broad daylight. But none of us mentioned staying another night, even though we'd originally planned to camp until Sunday. By mid-afternoon, I'd made up my mind. "I think I'm gonna head back today," I told the group as we sat around after lunch. "Got some work to catch up on before Monday." Jeff immediately said he'd go too. Dave and Ray exchanged glances, then also said they'd leave early. The others looked confused. "What's going on with you guys?" Mike asked. "We've got steaks for tonight. Weather's perfect." "Just got stuff to do," I said vaguely. I didn't want to freak out the guys who hadn't heard what we heard. Mike tried to convince us to stay, but I could see he was fighting a losing battle. Within an hour, half the group was packing up to leave. The other half decided to stay, still baffled by our sudden departure. As I was loading my gear into my Explorer, Dave came over. "You think we should tell them about what we heard?" I looked over at the remaining campers, laughing and setting up for another night. "Would you have believed it if you hadn't heard it yourself?" He shook his head. "I guess not. But if it comes back tonight, they're all armed," I reminded him. "They'll be fine." But I didn't entirely believe that. Before I left, I pulled Mike aside. "Listen," I said, "just keep the fire big tonight, okay? And maybe sleep in shifts." He gave me a strange look. "You seriously spooked about something, James? That's not like you." I couldn't explain it to him. How do you tell someone about a fear that has no name, no shape? How do you describe the feeling that something intelligent but not human was watching you from the darkness? "Just be careful," I said finally. I followed Jeff's car back down the Forest Service road with Dave and Ray behind me. None of us talked about it on the drive home. In fact, we barely discussed it afterwards. The guys who stayed that second night never reported anything unusual happening, and over time it became this weird, unspoken thing among those of us who'd heard it. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was other campers playing a prank, though that seems incredibly unlikely given our location and the fact that we were obviously a large group of armed men. Maybe it was some kind of rare atmospheric phenomenon or animals making unusual sounds. But deep down, I know better. Whatever was out there in those woods was intelligent. It coordinated. It communicated. It watched us. It tested our boundaries with those tossed stones, and somehow instinctually we all knew not to pursue it into the trees. I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I still go camping, still enjoy the outdoors, but always in established campgrounds now, never in the deep backcountry, and I always sleep in my vehicle, never in a tent. Sometimes at night, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I think I hear that clicking sound again, soft and rhythmic, just outside my bedroom window. Then I snap fully awake, heart pounding, straining to listen. But it's never there. Just the normal sounds of the city at night. And I lie awake until dawn, wondering what was out there in the darkness of those woods, and if someday I'll hear those sounds again. Story 9. I've never been the type to believe in the paranormal. Not ghosts, not aliens, and definitely not Bigfoot. I'm a mechanical engineer who deals with cold, hard reality every day. But what happened that day in 2001 changed everything I thought I knew about our world. It was April 14th, 2001. I remember the exact date because it was the weekend before tax day, and I'd been stressing about getting my returns finished. My friend Rachel suggested a hike to clear my head. Rachel and I had been friends since college. She's this environmental scientist who's always dragging me outdoors, which honestly I need sometimes when I get too wrapped up in work. We chose Silver Ridge in the Cascades, about 2 hours from Seattle. It wasn't a difficult trail, rated moderate with some decent elevation gain, but nothing too strenuous. The weather that day was typical Pacific Northwest spring, overcast but not raining, around 55 degrees. Perfect hiking weather, really. We got to the trailhead around 1 p.m. I remember checking my watch because Rachel was running late, as usual. The parking lot was maybe half full, but we didn't see many people on the trail itself. A few couples passed us early on, heading back already, and a group of college-aged kids with day packs who were moving faster than us. The hike up was uneventful, beautiful, but normal. We spotted some early wildflowers, a couple of stellar jays, and Rachel got excited about some kind of moss I couldn't tell apart from any other moss. We reached a nice viewpoint around 4 p.m. and stopped to eat the sandwiches and trail mix we'd packed. It was getting close to 6 p.m. when we decided to head back. The light was starting to fade, not sunset yet, but that dusky in-between time when shadows get longer. We weren't concerned about getting caught in the dark. We had about 2 hours of daylight left, and the trail back would take maybe 90 minutes max. We'd been walking downhill for maybe 20 minutes when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind through the trees or maybe water running somewhere nearby. But then it came again, this weird, muffled cry echoing through the forest. It's hard to describe accurately. It was like a deep, guttural growl, but mixed with what sounded like broken words. Not clear words, nothing I could understand, but not just animal noises either. It had this rhythm to it that animal sounds don't usually have. Rachel stopped dead in her tracks. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe someone's hurt." The sound came again, longer this time. Rachel grinned nervously and said, "Dude, it sounds like Chewbacca." She was right. It had that same kind of quality, that rumbling vocalization that's not quite human, but not quite animal either. Here's the thing. We weren't scared. Not yet. We were curious. If it had been nighttime, I probably would have been freaked out. But in the fading daylight, with another person beside me, it seemed more interesting than threatening. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Nothing. Just birds and the rustle of trees. We stood there for maybe a minute, listening. Then the sound came again, from further down the trail. "Should we check it out?" Rachel asked. She'd always been more adventurous than me. "I guess so," I said. "What if someone's hurt?" So we continued down the trail, moving a bit more cautiously now. The trail curved and sloped downward into a denser section of forest. Old-growth stuff with huge trunks and a thick canopy that made it darker than the rest of the trail. The temperature seemed to drop a few degrees as we entered this section. The sound came again, closer now. It made the hair on my arms stand up. Something about it just felt wrong, primal. There was this sense of raw power behind it that I can't explain. "Hello?" I called again, my voice not as confident as before. That's when we heard the movement. Not just footsteps, but the violent thrashing of underbrush being pushed aside. Something big was moving through the forest, just off the trail, and it was moving fast. I remember looking at Rachel, and her eyes were wide. We both froze, suddenly not so sure about our decision to investigate. Then it happened. About 10 feet ahead of us, a stand of young trees shook violently, and something burst through them onto the trail. Something massive, something upright. Even in the dim light, I could see it clearly enough to know this wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or could rationalize away. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, covered in thick, matted hair from head to toe. Not fur like a bear, but longer, shaggier, almost like human hair, but everywhere. The color was this dark, reddish-brown, like old rust. But what struck me most was its build. This thing was massive. Not just tall, but broad, with shoulders that seemed too wide for anything human. Its head sat low, between those shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck. I couldn't make out clear facial features. It was too dim, and everything happened too fast. But I remember seeing the outline of a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like deeply set eyes. The creature stopped for maybe a second when it saw us. Just a heartbeat of time where we stared at each other. I don't know what I was expecting, an attack, a roar, something, but instead it just turned and bounded down the slope away from the trail with shocking speed. It moved like nothing I've ever seen, not like a person in a costume, not like a bear on its hind legs. It had this fluid, powerful motion that covered ground incredibly quickly. It disappeared into the trees within seconds, the sound of breaking branches marking its path down the slope. Rachel and I stood there, frozen in absolute shock. I think it was a full minute before either of us spoke. "Did you—" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "Did you see that?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. "That wasn't a bear," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," I agreed. "It definitely wasn't a bear." We stood there for another minute, listening. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no small animals, nothing. Just our own heavy breathing and the faint sound of wind in the upper branches. "We should go," I finally said. "Now!" We practically ran down that trail. Neither of us spoke much. We were too focused on getting back to the car as quickly as possible. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing following us, but the trail behind us remained empty. We made it back to the parking lot just as true darkness was setting in. By then, we were the only car left. We jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, still processing. "What do we do?" Rachel asked. "Should we report it to someone?" I thought about it. Who would believe us? The park rangers? Wildlife officers? We'd sound crazy. "We could say we saw a bear," she suggested. "But it wasn't a bear," I said. "You know it wasn't. And what proof do we have? No pictures, no video." This was 2001. Neither of us had brought cameras, and cell phones weren't what they are today. My Nokia was sitting in the glove compartment, and it certainly didn't have a camera. In the end, we decided not to report it. Who would believe us? 2 hikers claiming they saw Bigfoot. We'd be laughed out of the ranger station. The drive home was quiet. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear after all, just in weird lighting. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, but deep down we both knew. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to find some explanation that made sense. But there wasn't one. What we'd seen didn't fit into any category of animal I knew. The next day, Rachel called me. "I've been researching," she said. She'd spent the night looking up Sasquatch sightings in the Cascades. Turns out there had been several reports from that general area over the years. Not many recently, but enough to establish a pattern. We promised each other we'd go back with cameras, maybe try to find tracks or other evidence. But we never did. Life got in the way. Work, relationships, all the usual excuses. And honestly, I think we were both a little afraid of what we might find if we went looking. Over time, we talked about it less and less. Rachel moved to California for work a couple years later, and we gradually lost touch. But I've never forgotten what I saw that day. I've told a few people over the years. Most react with skepticism or outright disbelief, which I understand. I was a skeptic too once. Some ask why I don't go on TV or try to prove what I saw. The answer is simple. I have no proof, just my experience. And I've made my peace with that. But I know what I saw that day in the fading light of Silver Ridge. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. The way it moved, the intelligence in those eyes when it paused and looked at us. There was awareness there, a consciousness. I still hike, still love the outdoors. But I'm more alert now, more aware of my surroundings. And sometimes, when I'm deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the light starts to fade, I find myself listening more carefully, scanning the trees more thoroughly. Because now I know that sometimes, when you feel like you're being watched in the wilderness, you are. There are things out there we don't understand, living alongside us, mostly unseen. Things that have learned to stay hidden, to exist in the margins of our world. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but that day changed how I see the world and our place in it. Whatever that creature was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or something science hasn't classified yet, it was real. As real as the ground beneath my feet or the computer I'm typing on right now. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder, is it still out there? Does it remember our encounter as clearly as I do? And how many others like it exist, moving silently through the ancient forests, watching us even as we convince ourselves they can't possibly be real? Story 10. I've never told this story before. Not to my family, Not to friends, not even to my wife. It's been over 20 years now, and the memory still gives me chills. I've always worried people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure strangers on the internet might be more open-minded. This happened in January 2002 on Great North Mountain in Virginia. Me and my two buddies, Mark and Dave, were experienced backpackers. We'd done dozens of winter hikes together across the Appalachians. This particular trip was supposed to be a 4-day trek through Shenandoah. We had reserved Sugar Knob Cabin in Shenandoah County as our base for the first 2 nights. If you've never been to this area in winter, it's eerily beautiful but isolating as hell. The cabin itself is an old stone structure, sturdy, rustic, with wooden shutters over the windows and a small front porch. It sits in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. There's one main room with a wood stove, some basic furniture, and a loft area with sleeping space. Nothing fancy, but perfect for hikers who want shelter from the winter elements. We'd hiked about 7 miles that day to reach the cabin. The temperature was hovering around 20 degrees, and everything was covered in a thin layer of ice. The wind was cutting through our layers, even though we were properly geared up. We were all relieved when we spotted the cabin around 3 p.m. The first few hours were totally normal. We unpacked, claimed our sleeping spots, and decided to get a fire going outside to cook dinner before it got dark. There was a designated fire pit about 15 feet from the cabin door. Mark got the fire started while Dave and I sorted through our food supplies. It was around 4:30 p.m. when we first heard it. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. I remember because I had just checked my watch, thinking we needed to finish cooking before full darkness. That's when the footsteps started. At first, I thought it was just ice falling from tree branches, but then it became unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate steps crunching on the frozen ground. They were coming from the tree line about 50 yards behind the cabin. What struck me immediately was the rhythm. Slow, methodical, definitely bipedal, not the 4-legged pattern of a deer or bear. It was walking upright like a person. "You guys hear that?" Dave asked, his breath visible in the cold air. We all fell silent, listening. The footsteps continued, moving parallel to the tree line, like whatever it was circling our position. "Hello?" Mark called out. "Anybody there?" Nothing, just those steady footsteps. "Probably another hiker," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't right. It didn't sound like someone approaching. It sounded like someone or something patrolling. "In January, this far out," Dave said, echoing my thoughts. We kept cooking, but we were all on edge now. Every few minutes the footsteps would pause, then resume, gradually working their way around the perimeter of the clearing, always maintaining distance, never coming closer, never moving away. As dusk settled in, we decided to head inside with our food. The temperature was dropping fast, and frankly, none of us wanted to be outside in the dark with whatever was out there. The cabin had no electricity, just the wood stove and our headlamps. We lit a couple of lanterns and tried to act normal, like we weren't all thinking about those footsteps. "Probably just a game warden checking the area," Mark suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We ate dinner at the small wooden table in silence, straining to hear over our chewing. For about 20 minutes, there was nothing. Then the footsteps returned. Despite the stone walls of the cabin being fairly good at insulating sound, we could hear them clearly now. They were closer, much closer. Whatever it was had approached the clearing and was now walking slowly around the cabin itself. The sound was unmistakable on the frozen ground. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, steady and deliberate. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't trying to be quiet. It was like it wanted us to know it was there. "What the hell?" Dave whispered. I felt my throat tighten. "Maybe we should look outside." Mark shook his head. "Let's just wait. It'll go away." But it didn't go away. For the next hour, the footsteps circled the cabin at least 4 times, sometimes moving away briefly only to return. It was like whatever was out there was studying us, looking for a way in, or just toying with us. Around 8 p.m., the footsteps stopped again. We all exchanged glances, wondering if it had finally left. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then came 3 heavy footsteps right up to the front of the cabin, directly outside the window near our table. I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't just the crunch of ice beneath weight. There was something else, a kind of heavy breathing that seemed to vibrate the very air inside the cabin. The wooden shutters on the window rattled slightly. My mouth went dry. Dave's face had gone pale in the lantern light. Mark looked at the window, then at us. "We need to see what it is," he said firmly. "Are you crazy?" Dave hissed. "We can't just sit here all night wondering," Mark insisted. "If it's a person, we need to know. If it's an animal, we need to know what kind." Before either of us could stop him, Mark grabbed his flashlight and moved to the window. The shutters were closed, but there was a small latch that allowed them to be opened from inside. His hand shook slightly as he reached for it. I held my breath. Dave was frozen in place. Mark unlatched the shutter and swung it open in one quick motion, raising his flashlight at the same time. What happened next has replayed in my mind thousands of times over the years. For a split second, illuminated in the beam of Mark's flashlight, not more than a foot away from the window, was a face. Not a human face. It was massive, much larger than any human head I've ever seen. It was covered in dark, matted hair, except for the area around the eyes, nose, and mouth. The skin visible there was a grayish-brown, leathery texture. The eyes reflected the flashlight with a deep reddish glow, like a deer's eyes, but larger, more intelligent. But it was the expression that haunts me to this day. It wasn't mindless or animalistic. There was recognition there, curiosity, intelligence. It was studying us as much as we were studying it. We all saw it, all 3 of us, in that fraction of a second before it reacted. Then everything happened at once. The creature jerked backward from the window. Mark yelled something incoherent. I knocked over my chair, scrambling backward. Dave actually fell to the floor. There was a sound of heavy, rapid footsteps retreating from the cabin, crunching through the frozen underbrush. Within seconds, they faded into the distance. The 3 of us just stared at each other, wide-eyed and breathing hard. "What the fuck was that?" Dave finally managed. Mark closed and latched the shutter with shaking hands. "I don't know. It looked like—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. It had looked like something that shouldn't exist. None of us slept that night. We took turns keeping watch, though we didn't hear the footsteps again. We talked in hushed voices about what we'd seen. None of us wanted to say the word that was on all our minds, but eventually Mark just said it. "It looked like a Sasquatch." "Bigfoot isn't real," Dave said automatically, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Then what did we just see?" I asked. No one had an answer. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first grey light filtered through the shutters, we packed our gear, desperate to get out of there. The temperature had dropped further overnight, and everything outside was covered in a thick layer of ice. That's when we realized something even more unsettling. Despite the heavy footsteps we'd heard, despite the ice covering every surface, there were no tracks. Nothing. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed except for our own footprints from the day before. We should have investigated more, taken pictures, looked harder for evidence, but honestly, we just wanted to get the hell out of there. We hiked down Stony Creek Trail in record time, barely speaking, constantly looking over our shoulders. It wasn't until we were back in my truck, heater blasting, that Mark mentioned the cabin journal. "Did either of you read it?" he asked. We hadn't. The cabin had a logbook where hikers could leave notes about their stays. It was standard practice in these remote shelters. "There were other stories," Mark said quietly. "I flipped through it while you guys were packing up. Other hikers reported hearing things circling the cabin, Some mentioned feeling watched. One entry from last winter described unexplained bipedal tracks in the snow around the cabin. We drove home in silence after that. In the days that followed, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe it was the cold and isolation playing tricks on our minds. But we all saw it, clear as day. That face in the window. The three of us made a pact not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. But we also agreed never to go back to that part of the mountains again. Dave and Mark still go hiking with me sometimes, but we never speak about what happened at Sugar Knob Cabin. When planning routes, we silently agree to stay away from Great North Mountain. For years, I've researched Sasquatch sightings in Virginia. There are more than you'd think, especially in the more remote parts of the Appalachians. Some descriptions match exactly what we saw. The size, the face, the intelligence in the eyes. I don't know what we encountered that winter night in 2002. I can't explain why it left no tracks in the ice or why it was so interested in us, but I know what I saw. Sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls outside my window, I remember those slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. And I wonder if it's still out there, still watching, still waiting, and I wonder if anyone else has seen it since. Story 11. I've been debating whether to share this for years. What happened that day in '98 still gives me goosebumps when I think about it. I've only told a few close friends, and even then, I can tell most of them think I'm exaggerating or flat out making it up. But I know what Sean and I saw. I know it was real. It was August 1st, 1998. Sean and I had been camping in Tillamook County for the weekend. We were engaged at the time, young and carefree, spending as much time outdoors as possible before settling down. Oregon summers are gorgeous. Not too hot usually, perfect for camping. But that weekend was different. The temperature had climbed into the 90s, which is pretty unusual for the area, especially near the coast. By Sunday around noon, we'd packed up our campsite. We weren't ready to head home to Portland yet, though. It was too damn hot in the city, and neither of us was eager to return to our apartment with no AC. Sean suggested we stop by the Wilson River to cool off on our way back. It wasn't exactly on our route home, but with that heat, any detour for a swimming spot was worth it. The Wilson River is beautiful. Crystal clear water running through Tillamook Forest, with plenty of little spots where you can pull off the highway and access the river. We found a secluded area with a small, pebbly beach, perfect for spreading out our towels. The river there forms these natural pools, deep enough to swim in, but with gentle currents. We changed into our swimsuits behind the car, there wasn't another soul around, spread our towels on the smooth river rocks, and just laid there for a bit, soaking up the sun. It must have been around 1 p.m. at this point. I remember closing my eyes, listening to the river bubbling over the rocks, feeling completely relaxed. Sean was beside me, already half asleep in the warmth. I propped myself up on my elbows to take a swig from my water bottle when I noticed something weird on the other side of the river. At first, I thought it was someone wearing a big fur coat, which made absolutely no sense in that heat. It was standing in a calm section of the river, maybe 200 feet upstream from us. The river wasn't very wide there, maybe 30-40 feet across. Whatever it was seemed to be wading in the water, just standing there. I sat up fully, squinting against the sun. My first thought was, that's a weird-looking person. But something felt off immediately. The proportions weren't right. The arms seemed too long, hanging down almost to the knees. And who wears a full fur coat to wade in a river on a 90-degree day? That's when it hit me. Holy shit, I thought, that's not a person. I glanced at Sean, who was still sunbathing with her eyes closed. I didn't want to freak her out, so I didn't say anything. I just kept watching. For about half an hour, this thing walked slowly up and down in a small section of the river. It seemed to be looking down into the water, like it was searching for something. Fish, maybe? It moved with this strange confidence over the slippery river rocks. Anyone who's walked in a river knows how treacherous those smooth stones can be, but this creature moved like the rocks weren't even there. It was only in the water up to its calves, so I could see most of its body clearly. It stood about 6 to 6.5 feet tall, covered in this thick, dark brown hair. In the sunlight, the hair had these reddish glints to it. The head seemed slightly lighter in color than the rest of the body. What struck me most was how it barely had a neck. The head just seemed to sit directly on the shoulders. I kept darting glances at Sean, not wanting to wake her, but also desperately wanting her to see this too. I needed confirmation that I wasn't hallucinating from the heat or something. Finally, Sean stirred and sat up. She reached for her water bottle and followed my gaze across the river. I heard her sharp intake of breath. "Kurt," she whispered, "what is that?" Before I could answer, she stood up and walked toward the water's edge. That's when everything changed. The creature, which had been focused on the water the whole time, suddenly froze. It straightened up, standing fully upright now, and turned to face us directly. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. Sean stopped dead in her tracks. For what felt like forever, but was probably about 15 minutes, we just stared at each other. The three of us forming this bizarre triangle of mutual assessment. What surprised me most was that I didn't feel afraid, exactly. Awestruck, yes. Disbelieving, definitely. But not terror. There was something almost curious in the way it was observing us, like we were as strange to it as it was to us. With it facing us, I could get a better look. The face was incredibly dark, so dark that all I could really make out was where the eyes were, deeply recessed under what had to be prominent brow ridges. It reminded me of those reconstructions you see of early humans, but more, I don't know, present, alive, intelligent. I still wasn't letting myself think the word that was screaming in my mind, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. It seemed too ridiculous, too impossible. But what else could it be? No bear stands like that. No person has those proportions. No known animal moves through the forest and river with that particular mixture of grace and raw power. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It started moving again, but this time crossing the river, toward us. I grabbed Sean's hand instinctively, but we didn't run. The creature didn't seem aggressive. It crossed the river with deliberate, careful steps, the water barely seeming to impede its movement. When it reached our side, about 150 feet away from us, it moved behind a large bush, partially obscuring itself, but it didn't leave. I could still see parts of it through the foliage, and I realized it was watching us, hiding, but not completely, like a child playing an awkward game of hide-and-seek, thinking they're invisible when they're clearly not. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't a full-grown adult whatever it was. This was young, a juvenile. That explained the size, which was tall but not massive. The rounded head without the pronounced sagittal crest you hear about in Bigfoot stories, and the lack of any visible sexual characteristics. It was a youngster. And now it was curious about us. The longer we stood there, the more my initial amazement gave way to a growing unease. Where there's a young animal, there's usually a protective parent nearby. If this was indeed what I thought it was, I did not want to meet its mother or father. "We should go," I whispered to Sean, not taking my eyes off the creature. She nodded, and we slowly backed up toward our car, gathering our towels as we went. The creature stayed behind its bush, watching us retreat. It made no move to follow, no sound, no threatening gesture, just watched with those dark, recessed eyes. We got in the car, and I started the engine with shaking hands. As we pulled away, I checked the rearview mirror and saw it step out from behind the bush, standing in full view now, watching our car disappear down the road. The drive home was almost completely silent. Finally, about 20 minutes later, Sean looked at me and said, "What the fuck did we just see?" I shook my head. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But I did know. We both did. We just couldn't bring ourselves to say it out loud, as if naming it would somehow make the experience too real to process. The entire encounter lasted about an hour that completely changed how I view the world and what might exist in the forgotten corners of it. To this day, I can close my eyes and see that creature perfectly. The way it moved, the sunlight glinting red in its dark hair, those eyes watching us from the shadows of its face. I've spent countless hours researching since then, reading every account I could find of similar encounters. So many details match what others have reported. The reddish tint to the hair, the proportions, the way it moved through difficult terrain with ease. But none of those accounts capture what it felt like to stand there, just a few hundred feet from something science says doesn't exist. I don't know why it showed itself to us that day. I don't know if it was an intentional encounter or if we just happened to surprise each other. All I know is that somewhere in the forests of Oregon, there are things walking on two legs that aren't human, things that watch us from the shadows with intelligence behind their eyes. We never went back to that spot on the Wilson River. Sean and I got married the following year, but we never again camped in Tillamook County. Some experiences, no matter how amazing, you don't tempt fate by trying to repeat. I still think about what might have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we'd tried to communicate somehow. But mostly, I wonder about that juvenile creature. Is it still out there, now grown? Does it remember the two humans it met on a hot summer day beside the river? Does it tell its own kind about us, the way I'm telling you about it now? I don't expect anyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if someone else told me this story. But on August 2nd, 1998, in the heat of an Oregon summer, Sean and I spent an hour in the presence of something extraordinary, and nothing has felt quite the same since. Story 12. I still don't know how to explain what happened that day. It's been over 25 years since that November afternoon in Tillamook County, and I've gone back and forth about sharing this. My wife Karen, her grandmother Elaine, and my buddy Mike's wife Jen all saw it. Mike and I didn't. We were setting up the damn tent when it happened, and that still bugs me to this day. It was November 8th, 1997. I remember the date perfectly because it was the weekend before Veterans Day, and Mike had taken some extra days off from work. Mike had served as a Marine for 12 years and was always the most level-headed, no-nonsense guy I knew. He'd roll his eyes whenever anyone mentioned anything about Bigfoot or Sasquatch. "People see what they want to see," he'd always say. We'd found this perfect spot for camping on an old helicopter landing pad from when they used to do more logging in the area. It was up on this ridge with an incredible view looking down into a massive Clearcut, probably about 400 to 500 yards across before the trees started again on the other side. The logging company had cleared everything out maybe 5 to 6 years before, but it was still mostly just stumps, fallen logs, and low brush. From our vantage point, you could see pretty much everything happening in that clearing. The weather that weekend was surprisingly decent for November in Oregon. It wasn't raining for once, just overcast and cool, around 45-50 degrees. We'd arrived around 2 p.m. and were just getting everything set up for the night. Karen, Elaine, and Jen were hanging out near the edge of the ridge, drinking coffee from our thermos and looking out at the view while Mike and I wrestled with the tent poles. It was about 4:30 p.m., still plenty of light left, but getting towards late afternoon, when I heard Elaine say, "Oh, look at that. Is that an elk down there?" I was untangling guy lines and didn't look up immediately. Then Karen said something that made my blood run cold. "That's not an elk. What the hell is that?" Her voice had this strange tension in it. I turned around and saw all 3 women standing frozen, staring down into the clear cut. Before I could even get over to them, Jen said, "It's running on 2 legs." By the time Mike and I reached them, Whatever they'd seen had disappeared back into the trees. Karen was shaking. "Did you see that? Tell me you saw that." "Saw what?" "What happened?" I asked, scanning the Clearcut and seeing nothing unusual. Elaine, who was 72 at the time and the most no-nonsense woman I've ever known, was white as a sheet. "Something came out of the trees over there." She pointed to the far left edge of the Clearcut. "I thought it was an elk at first, but it was walking upright. Then it started running." Jen was holding a hand over her mouth, just staring at the spot where they'd seen it. It moved so fast through all that brush. Nothing moves like that. Mike immediately went into practical mode. "Was it a bear? Bears sometimes stand up." Karen shook her head emphatically. "It wasn't standing up like a bear. It was running on two legs the whole time. Fast, like a person, but not a person." I grabbed my binoculars from my pack and started scanning the tree line. Part of me thought they must have seen a hiker or maybe a hunter in dark clothing. But Karen kept insisting. It had hair all over it, dark hair, and it was big. We stood there for maybe 10 minutes, all of us watching the Clearcut. I was just about to suggest we go back to setting up camp when we heard the sound of dirt bikes in the distance. A few minutes later, 2 riders appeared on a trail that cut through the right side of the Clearcut. They were moving slow, picking their way through some muddy sections. That's when Jen gasped and grabbed my arm. "There it is again! It's moving back into the trees!" I swung my binoculars to where she was pointing, near where they'd first seen the figure. I caught just a glimpse of movement at the edge of the tree line, but nothing clear. The dirt bikes revved louder as they got closer to the middle of the Clearcut. "It's hiding from the dirt bikes," Elaine said quietly. We all stood there tense, watching. The dirt bikers continued along their trail, oblivious to anything unusual. They disappeared over a small rise in the middle of the Clearcut. Then Karen suddenly grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug in. "Oh my God, there's 2 of them now." This time I saw it. About 100 yards from where they'd spotted the first figure, 2 dark shapes emerged from the tree line. Even from our distance I could tell they were large, one significantly bigger than the other, and they were moving in a way that sent chills down my spine. They weren't lumbering like bears. They were running upright, moving with purpose, swinging what looked like long arms. I'm not sure how to describe the way they moved. It was fluid, but powerful. They navigated over fallen logs and around stumps without slowing down, taking a different path than the first sighting, angling toward the far side of the Clearcut. The smaller one trailed slightly behind the larger one. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, binoculars pressed to his face. Coming from him, that question hit different. He wasn't a guy who got spooked. The creatures covered the entire clearing in what seemed like less than a minute. No human could move that fast through that terrain. It wasn't just their speed, but the efficiency of their movement. No wasted energy, no hesitation. They disappeared into the tree line on the far side, just as the dirt bikers came back into view over the rise. We stood there in stunned silence for maybe 30 seconds before Mike finally lowered his binoculars. His hands were shaking. In 12 years knowing him, I'd never seen that. "What did we just see?" Jen asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The dirt bikers continued on their trail and eventually disappeared from view, completely unaware of what had just passed less than 200 yards from them. That night around the campfire, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was other hikers wearing dark clothes, but no hiker could move that fast through that terrain. Bears. Bears don't run on 2 legs for sustained periods, and their movement is completely different. What about guys in costumes playing a prank? In the middle of nowhere, perfectly timed with the dirt bikes moving at impossible speeds. Elaine, who had grown up in rural Oregon and spent her whole life outdoors, just kept shaking her head. "I've seen every animal in these woods. That wasn't anything I recognize." What struck me most was how quiet we all were that night. Normally on these trips, we'd stay up late, drink some beers, tell stories. That night, no one wanted to wander too far from the fire. No one wanted to talk too loud. We all kept looking toward the tree line, even though our campsite was nowhere near where we'd seen the figures. Around midnight, we heard wood knocking sounds from the forest. 3 distinct knocks, then silence. Then, about 10 minutes later, 3 more knocks from a different direction. Mike loaded his handgun and kept it next to his sleeping bag. None of us slept well. At first light, we packed up camp without discussion and headed out. On the drive home, Mike finally broke the silence. I've spent my whole life thinking Bigfoot was bullshit, something people made up or mistook for bears. But what we saw... He trailed off, shaking his head. The most convincing thing for me wasn't even what I glimpsed through the binoculars. It was the reactions of the others. Karen refused to talk about it for weeks. Elaine, who I'd never seen afraid of anything, asked us to drive her home rather than back to our place as planned. She didn't want to be on the roads after dark, and Mike, who'd laugh off ghost stories and monster sightings, researched local Bigfoot encounters for months afterward. We reported what we saw to the BFRO, Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, a few weeks later. They sent some investigators who took our statements and searched the area, but by then any tracks would have been washed away by the constant November rain. I've gone back and forth over the years about what we saw. Sometimes, in the middle of normal life, with bills and jobs and everyday concerns, it seems absurd. 2 hairy humanoid creatures racing through the Oregon woods. It sounds crazy. But then I remember the absolute conviction in Karen's voice, the fear on Elaine's face, and the way Mike's hands shook as he lowered those binoculars. I know what bears look like, what elk look like, what humans in the woods look like. This was something else entirely. The way they moved, efficient, powerful and fast, through terrain that would have most humans carefully picking their way step by step. The obvious intelligence in the way they retreated when the dirt bikes appeared, then found another route. The coordination between the 2 of them. Karen still doesn't like talking about it. She says it made her realize how little we actually know about the world around us, how many assumptions we make about what is and isn't possible. Mike, the skeptic, now keeps a digital camera with him whenever we go camping, just in case. I don't know what we saw that November afternoon in Tillamook County. I can't explain it, but I know that 4 reasonable, level-headed adults witnessed something that doesn't fit into our normal understanding of what lives in the Pacific Northwest woods. Sometimes at night I still hear those wood knocks in my dreams. 3 distinct sounds. Then silence. Then 3 more from another direction, as if they were communicating, as if they were watching us, just as we had watched them. Story 13. I never thought I'd share this. Even now, typing this out makes my heart race. But after all this time, I need to get it off my chest. This happened back in August 1995, August 14th to be exact. I was working as a Forest Service officer at the time, and my girlfriend Julie, who was in local law enforcement, and I decided to take advantage of a rare 2-day break by camping on the beach along the Oregon coast. We found this perfect little spot north of Lincoln City but south of Tillamook. It was secluded, peaceful, exactly what we wanted. We set up camp on this small bluff about 7 feet above the beach. It was a gorgeous day, clear skies, mild temperature, just perfect. We spent the afternoon relaxing, swimming a bit and grilling some food. Everything was so normal. As the sun started to set, we were sitting in our camp chairs watching the waves and enjoying a couple beers. That's when I first noticed it. About 100 yards down the beach to the south, there was this figure. At first, I thought it was just another beachgoer taking an evening walk. But something felt off about it. It looked like it was covered head to toe in black clothing or something dark. I nudged Julie and pointed it out. "Who wears all black to the beach?" she said, squinting to get a better look. We watched as this figure slowly walked up the beach toward us. It got to about 50 yards away, then suddenly turned around and walked back south, Weird, but not alarming. Maybe they realized they'd wandered too far from their own campsite or something. But then, about 15 minutes later, there it was again. Same thing. Walking up from the south, getting a bit closer this time, maybe 40 yards away before turning back. "That's the same person, right?" Julie asked. I nodded, starting to feel uneasy. This pattern continued for nearly an hour. Each time, this figure would come back, and each time it would get a little closer before turning around. It was getting darker now, making it harder to make out details, but the black shape against the lighter sand was still visible. On what must have been the 5th or 6th approach, the figure came much closer than before. That's when we both realized something was seriously wrong. This thing, I can't call it a person anymore, was tall. Impossibly tall. Remember, we were on a 7-foot bluff above the beach, and as it passed by, its head was level with ours. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. Julie grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. As it moved, I could see it better. It wasn't wearing black clothes. It was black, jet black from head to foot. Its head looked pointed, almost conical. Its posture was weird, too, hunched forward with arms that seemed too long for its body. They swung in this fluid, almost mechanical way as it walked. The way it moved was all wrong. It wasn't running, but it covered ground incredibly fast. I'd guess 4-6 mph, smooth, like a video being fast-forwarded and completely silent. The beach wasn't empty. There were other campers further away, but nobody else seemed to notice this thing. After it passed by us and headed south again, I felt this overwhelming need to investigate. Julie thought I was crazy, but I had to know what we were dealing with. I grabbed my flashlight and my service weapon, thank God I had it with me, and headed down to the beach. "Be careful," Julie called after me, her voice shaking. "I don't like this." Neither did I, but I needed to see. I walked to where the figure had passed by, sweeping my flashlight across the sand. What I found still haunts me. Footprints, if you can call them that. They were enormous, at least 16 inches long, 10 inches wide, and sunk deep into the sand, maybe 10 inches deep. Whatever made these tracks had to weigh hundreds of pounds. I traced them with the beam of my flashlight, following the trail heading south. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and went out. Shit. I had fresh batteries, but sometimes the bulb connection got loose. I started to unscrew the cap to fix it when I heard Julie scream from our campsite. "It's coming back! Run!" I looked up, but without the flashlight, I could barely see anything in the growing darkness. Then I saw it. A massive black silhouette moving toward me at a fast pace. It was coming straight at me, and it didn't seem to be slowing down. "Stop!" I shouted, pulling out my weapon. "Stop right there!" It kept coming. My police training kicked in, and I shouted again, "I'm an officer! Stop or I'll shoot!" No response, no hesitation, just that same fluid, fast movement directly toward me. That's when it hit me. This thing wasn't human. It couldn't be. As it got closer, I could see its frame better against the last light of the sky. Its shoulders were massive, 4 or 5 feet wide at least. There was no neck I could discern, just this mass of what looked like hair covering its entire body. Every instinct screamed at me to shoot, but something held me back. Maybe it was training, maybe it was fear, maybe it was the bizarre realization that this creature, whatever it was, hadn't actually done anything threatening except exist and walk around. I backed up, then turned and ran as fast as I could back to Julie and our campsite. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I scrambled up the bluff and grabbed Julie, pulling her behind our vehicle. "What the hell is that thing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but it's not human." We watched as the creature walked directly past where I had been standing moments before. It didn't look around or search for me. It just continued its strange patrol, eventually turning south again and walking away. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, debating what to do. Our car was right there, and every logical part of me said we should throw our stuff in it and get the hell out of there. But the officer part of me kept thinking, this thing had multiple opportunities to hurt me or Julie, and it didn't. It just walked by. "Should we leave?" Julie asked, still clutching my arm. I hesitated, trying to make sense of it all. I think if it wanted to hurt us, it would have by now. That logic seems insane looking back, but in that moment it made sense. We decided to stay in the car with the doors locked, keeping watch in shifts. I don't think either of us slept more than 20 minutes at a time. Throughout the night, we saw the figure pass by 2 more times, always following the same pattern, walking north past our camp, then turning and heading south again. When morning finally came, I felt relief wash over me. In the daylight, everything seemed less terrifying. The creature hadn't appeared since about 3 a.m. I grabbed my camera and went back down to the beach to document the footprints before the tide came in and washed them away. They were still there, massive depressions in the sand, leading north and south along the beach. I took about a dozen photos, careful to place my boot next to some of them for scale. My size 12 boot looked tiny compared to these prints. We packed up camp faster than we ever had before and left. The whole drive home, we barely spoke. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible. When I developed the photos a few days later, they clearly showed the tracks. I showed them to a buddy in the department who had tracking experience. He just shook his head and said, "These aren't from any animal native to Oregon." I never reported it officially. Who would believe us? A giant black creature patrolling an Oregon beach. We'd be laughingstocks. Julie and I agreed to keep it to ourselves, though we did research similar sightings in the area. We found nothing concrete. We broke up about 6 months later. Not because of what happened, but I think that night changed us both in ways we couldn't articulate. To this day, I still have those photos somewhere in storage. Sometimes I think about digging them out, but then I remember the way that thing moved, how tall it stood, how it seemed to not even register my presence when it came right at me, and I leave the photos where they are. I've been back to the Oregon coast many times since then. It's beautiful country. But I've never returned to that stretch of beach, and I never will. Some things you only need to see once to know they're real, even if you can't explain them. And some places once visited are better left alone. I still don't know what we saw that night. I just know it wasn't human, and it owns that beach after dark. No. Story 14. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened that weekend at Rubicon. This was back in July 2001, and even after all these years, I get goosebumps thinking about it. My buddies Mark and Dave and I had been camping at this spot along the Rubicon River in Placer County for years, like clockwork, every summer since 95 or 96. It was our escape, you know, away from work, relationships, all that adult crap that was piling up as we hit our late 20s. We knew that area like the back of our hands, or at least we thought we did. We pulled up to our usual spot that Friday afternoon, right where the dirt road ends near that big outcropping of rocks. The drive had been the same as always, joking around, stopping for beef jerky and beer at that little store in Forest Hill, Dave's crappy truck stereo blasting the same Soundgarden tape it had for the past 3 years. Normal stuff. But I remember the moment we stepped out of the truck. Something felt off. "Guys, you hear that?" I asked as I grabbed my backpack from the truck bed. Mark looked at me funny. "Hear what?" "Exactly, nothing. Usually when we'd arrive, there'd be birds everywhere, maybe spot a squirrel or two, sometimes even deer if we were quiet coming in. But there was nothing. No chirping, no rustling in the bushes, no distant calls of hawks. Just the sound of the river flowing and the wind in the pines." Dave laughed it off. "Maybe they heard your snoring from last year and decided to evacuate." But I could tell he noticed it too by the way he kept looking around while we set up camp. Our spot was this nice flat area about 50 yards from the water, surrounded by tall pines and a few massive boulders that blocked the wind. We got the tents up, gathered some firewood, and cracked open beers as the sun started to set. We tried to shake off the weird vibe with our usual bullshit stories and catching up. That night, the silence was even more noticeable. No owls, no crickets, nothing. I kept waking up throughout the night, straining to hear anything. At one point, I swear I heard something large moving through the brush, maybe 100 yards away. Not like a deer or even a bear, but something that sounded deliberate, like it was trying to be quiet, but was too big to manage it completely. I told myself it was just my imagination and eventually fell back asleep. Morning came, and we made breakfast over the campfire. Bacon, eggs, and coffee in those dented metal camping mugs we'd had forever. The silence was still there, hanging over everything. "So, what's the plan today?" Dave asked through a mouthful of bacon. Mark suggested we head upstream to check out some swimming holes we'd found the previous year. It seemed like a good idea. Maybe things would feel more normal if we got moving. We packed some sandwiches, water bottles, and a couple beers each into our day packs and headed out. The trail along the river was familiar, weaving through boulders and patches of manzanita. About an hour upstream, we came to this rock formation we'd climbed before. This massive wall of granite that rises maybe 30-40 feet above the riverbed. From the top, you get this incredible view of the whole valley. "Race you to the top," Mark said, already scrambling up the first section. We took our usual route up, finding those familiar handholds and footholds. The rock was warm from the morning sun. At the top, we sat catching our breath and taking in the view. The river stretched out below us, carving its way through the dense forest. That's when Mark pointed to the other side of the river. "Hey, check that out," he said, nodding toward this deep crevice in the opposite bank. It was maybe 45 feet wide, cutting back into the hillside and filled with thick vegetation. Lots of young pines, manzanita and mountain dogwood. I'd never really paid much attention to it before, but something about the stillness of the day made it stand out. And then I saw movement. At first I thought it might be a shadow from clouds passing overhead, but the sky was perfectly clear. Then I figured maybe a bear was rooting around in there. We'd seen them in the area before, though usually they kept their distance. "You guys see that?" I whispered, not wanting to take my eyes off the spot. Dave nodded slowly. "Something's moving behind those bushes." We all went dead quiet, barely breathing, watching the spot where the brush was rustling. Then it emerged, and my entire understanding of the world changed in an instant. This thing came out into a slightly clearer area, crouching down but still partially hidden by the foliage. It was massive, covered in dark brown hair, almost black in some places. It had reached out with its right hand, not a paw, a hand, and grasped a small tree for balance as it moved. Even in its crouched position, I could tell this thing was huge, over 6 feet for sure, probably closer to 7. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear, the shoulders too broad, the head sitting directly on those shoulders rather than at the end of a neck like a bear's would. And its face, Jesus! It wasn't a snout. It was flat, like a primate's face, with deep-set eyes that I couldn't make out clearly from that distance, but I could feel them. I swear to God, I could feel it looking at us. None of us said a word. We were frozen, crouching on top of that rock, exposed and vulnerable. I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. My mouth went completely dry. The creature shifted its weight, and that's when I saw its feet. They were enormous, easily 1.5 feet long, if not bigger. They didn't look like bear paws or anything I'd ever seen before. They were feet, humanoid feet, but massive. It moved higher into the crevice, disappearing into a darker area where the trees and manzanita were thicker. We lost sight of it completely. For what felt like forever, we just stayed there, hardly breathing. Finally, Dave whispered, "What the fuck was that?" His voice was shaking. "We need to go," Mark said, already turning toward the descent path. "Now." No one argued. We scrambled down that rock face faster than was safe, slipping and scraping our hands on the rough granite. The whole time, I kept looking back toward that crevice, expecting to see that thing come bursting out after us. Once we hit the trail, we practically ran back toward camp. We didn't talk, didn't stop to rest, just kept moving as fast as we could without making too much noise. Every snap of a twig under our feet sounded like a gunshot in that unnatural silence. When we finally reached camp, Dave immediately started packing up his gear. "What are you doing?" I asked, though I already knew. "We're leaving," he said flatly. "I'm not spending another night out here." None of us wanted to say what we'd seen. It was like saying it out loud would make it more real somehow. But as we hurriedly packed up our campsite, Mark finally broke. "That was a fucking Sasquatch," he said, his voice low but intense. "That wasn't a bear, that wasn't anything normal." "Bigfoot isn't real," I said automatically, even as my hands shook trying to collapse my tent poles. "Then what the hell did we just see?" Dave demanded. "You saw its face. You saw how it moved." I had no answer. What I'd seen defied everything I thought I knew about the world. Bears don't have flat faces. They don't have hands that grasp trees like that. And they certainly don't move with that weird, fluid grace that thing had shown despite its size. We had the camp packed up in record time. The whole while, we kept scanning the tree line, jumping at every little sound. That hike back to the truck felt like the longest walk of my life. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, convinced that at any moment we'd see that massive, hair-covered figure emerging from between the trees. When we finally got to the truck and threw our gear in the back, Mark pointed something out that made my blood run cold. "Listen," he said. The silence was complete. In all our years coming to that spot, we'd never experienced anything like it. No birds, no insects, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. Nothing, like every living thing had evacuated the area except for us. And that thing. We piled into Dave's truck, and he didn't even wait for us to close our doors properly before gunning it down the dirt road, sending rocks and dust flying behind us. For the first 20 minutes of that drive, nobody said a word. Then Dave, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, broke the silence. "We all know what we saw, right? We're not crazy." "We saw something," I admitted. "Something big that had no business being there." "It was watching us," Mark said quietly from the back seat. "The whole time we were on that rock, it was watching us. I could feel it." I knew exactly what he meant. There had been an intelligence behind that encounter that terrified me more than the creature's size. It wasn't just some animal reacting on instinct. It had been observing us, assessing us. We tried to rationalize it on the drive home. Maybe it was some weird bear with a genetic deformity. Maybe it was a person in a suit, though that made no sense at all given where we were. But deep down, we all knew what we'd seen. I've never gone back to that spot on the Rubicon. None of us have. We don't even talk about it much anymore. What's the point? Nobody believes this stuff until they see it themselves. And trust me, you don't want to see what we saw. Sometimes I'll be falling asleep and I'll remember those few seconds when it emerged from the brush. That massive, dark figure moving with such controlled power, the way it grasped that tree with its hand, those enormous feet, that flat, almost human-like face. And I'll remember the silence, that complete, unnatural silence that had settled over a place we thought we knew so well. Like every living thing in that valley knew something we didn't. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone. Never in really remote places. And I always listen to the forest around me. As long as I can hear birds and insects and all the normal sounds of nature, I know things are okay. But the moment things go quiet, I'm out of there. What keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of what I saw. It's knowing that thing is probably still out there, moving through those woods, watching, waiting, and wondering if we were just lucky that day. If for some reason it chose to let us see it and then leave, or if next time someone else might not be so fortunate. Story 15. I've held this in for too long. I need to get this off my chest, even if most people still think I'm crazy or making it up. I know what I saw that day in the woods, and it wasn't a bear or a guy in a costume. It happened back in August 2006. I was working as a logger on Vancouver Island, up near the Nanaimo River in British Columbia. I'd been doing this job for nearly 15 years at that point. I know those woods like the back of my hand. Know every animal that lives there, every track, every sound. I'm not some tourist who panics at the sight of a black bear or mistakes a moose for something else. That Thursday started like any other summer work day. Hot as hell for the Pacific Northwest, maybe 85 degrees, which doesn't sound bad until you're working in it all day. I was operating one of the mechanical tree cutters with the big hydraulic shearing blades. Loud machines that can take down a decent-sized tree in seconds. I'd been cutting since about 6 a.m., taking small breaks here and there to drink water and cool off. It was around 2 p.m. when it happened. I was working a section near the river, about 2 miles from the main camp. The area was partially cleared, with patches of dense forest still standing. I'd just finished cutting through a section of smaller trees when I spotted what I initially thought were the hindquarters of a bear, about 50 yards ahead on the path. Nothing unusual about that. We see bears all the time up there. I did what we always do, made some noise to scare it off. I rattled the machine's blades a bit, which usually sends any wildlife running. That's when everything changed. Instead of scurrying away on all fours, this thing stood up, and kept standing until it was at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was massive, covered in thick, matted black hair from head to toe. The hair around its face was longer, obscuring its features, but I could make out eyes watching me from beneath that mess of fur. They weren't animal eyes. There was something behind them, something aware. My first thought was, what the actual fuck? I just sat there in the cab of my cutter, frozen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else entirely. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone playing a prank. But no costume could look that real. And nobody in their right mind would be wandering those woods in August heat wearing something like that. The thing just stood there for a moment, looking right at me. I swear it was sizing me up, trying to figure out what I was inside this big metal machine. Then, without warning, it turned and took 2 enormous strides toward a logging road that runs parallel to the river. I don't know what possessed me, but I started moving the cutter in that direction. Maybe curiosity, maybe disbelief. Maybe I just needed to confirm I wasn't hallucinating from heat exhaustion. I followed, keeping my distance, but closing in to about 20 feet from it. The creature must have sensed me following, because it suddenly bolted down the embankment toward the river. Its movement was strange, not quite human, not quite animal. It ran hunched over, but definitely on 2 legs, covering ground incredibly fast despite the steep decline. When it reached the river, it didn't hesitate, just plunged right in. But here's the weird part. It didn't swim well at all. It was struggling, making these awkward, clumsy strokes. Its head kept dipping below the surface, then coming back up with these loud, gasping sounds. The Nanaimo isn't a small river, especially in that section, and the current was moving pretty good that day. I stopped the cutter at the top of the embankment and just watched. Part of me wondered if I should try to help it. Crazy, right? But it was clearly having trouble. Eventually, it made it to the far bank, pulled itself out of the water, and stood there dripping wet, its chest heaving. The wet hair made it look even bigger somehow, like a massive shadow against the tree line. It turned and looked directly at me again. I can't explain it, but I felt something in that moment, some connection or recognition. Not friendly, not threatening, just acknowledgement. Then it turned and disappeared into the thick forest on the other side. I sat there for a good 5 minutes trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was racing and I felt lightheaded. I've been in the woods my entire life, seen all kinds of wildlife, but nothing like this. Nothing that made me question my own sanity. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I was still shaking. I told my supervisor, Mike, what I'd seen. Big mistake. He laughed his ass off, told me I was suffering from heat exhaustion, maybe dehydration. Said I should drink more water and take it easy for the rest of the day. The other guys were even worse, making Bigfoot jokes, asking if I'd been drinking on the job, the usual shit. I stopped talking about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I barely slept that night, just kept replaying the whole thing in my head. Those eyes, the way it moved, the struggle in the water. It was all too real, too detailed to be my imagination. 2 days later, on Saturday, I went back out with another logger named Dave. We were surveying property near what locals call Briar Bog, not far from where I had my first encounter. Dave didn't know about what happened. He worked a different section and hadn't heard the jokes yet. We were marking trees about a quarter-mile from the river when I saw it again. It was standing completely still by a cedar bush near the water's edge, about 80 feet away from us, just watching. If it hadn't been for the slight movement of the hair from the breeze, I might not have spotted it at all. Its stillness was unnatural, like it was trying to blend in with the surroundings. This time, I had a witness. I grabbed Dave's arm and pointed. "Do you see that by the cedar?" Dave squinted, then his eyes went wide. "What the fuck is that thing?" Before I could answer, I shouted at it. I don't know why, just instinct, I guess. "Hey!" The reaction was immediate. The creature turned and bolted north through the underbrush with incredible speed. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. But we could hear branches breaking and vegetation rustling as it tore through the forest. Dave and I just stood there staring at each other. "Was that what I think it was?" Dave finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said. "That's what I saw Thursday." This time when we got back to camp, things were different. Dave backed me up, and 2 witnesses are harder to dismiss than 1. My supervisor's attitude changed completely. He contacted the local authorities, who didn't seem particularly interested, but took a report anyway. Someone tipped off a local news station, and they sent out a reporter, but of course there was nothing to see by then. About a week later, this fisherman came forward saying he'd seen something similar about 6 weeks earlier, further downstream. He described a huge bipedal creature carrying what looked like a deer over its shoulder, trudging through a shallow part of the Nanaimo River. Said there was this powerful, musky smell that hit him before he even saw the thing. His story made me feel a little less crazy. The company tried to keep things quiet. Bad for business having your workers spot mythical creatures instead of cutting trees. They suggested we keep it to ourselves, implied our jobs might depend on it. So eventually, the whole thing died down. I still work in those woods, but I don't talk about what happened much anymore. People either believe you or they don't, and most don't. But sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet section of forest, I get this feeling like I'm being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I remember those eyes looking at me from across the river. What sticks with me most wasn't just how big it was, though that was shocking enough. It was the intelligence in those eyes. The way it watched me, assessed the situation, made decisions. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was something more there, something that understood what it was seeing and could think about how to respond. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or whatever name you want to give it. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and it's still out there in those woods. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I've run through every possible explanation in my head 1,000 times. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but does. And no matter how many people laugh or roll their eyes, I know what I saw that day by the Nanaimo River, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise.